November 3, 1875. President Ulysses S. Grant sat inside a second-floor office of the Executive Mansion. He stared down at a large, unrolled topographical map covering his oak desk. Secretary of War William Belknap and Secretary of the Interior Zachariah Chandler stood nearby, waiting for a decision. The men discussed the ongoing crisis in the Dakota Territory. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had designated the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, meant for the exclusive use of the indigenous population. An expedition the previous year had confirmed the presence of gold in those hills. The resulting influx of civilian prospectors created an uncontrollable situation for the military units stationed nearby. The United States Army had initially received orders to blockade the trails leading into the Black Hills and evict any trespassers found panning the streams. The sheer volume of incoming miners overwhelmed the small cavalry detachments assigned to this duty. Soldiers would escort a group of prospectors out of the territory, only for those same individuals to turn around and sneak back in through a different valley days later. Grant reviewed the recent failure of the Allison Commission, a government delegation sent to negotiate the purchase of the mineral-rich land from the Lakota tribes. The Native American leaders adamantly refused to sell or lease the territory. Facing immense political pressure from Eastern citizens demanding access to the gold fields, Grant made a firm executive decision during this meeting. He instructed the War Department to stand down and cease all military efforts to remove the civilian prospectors from the treaty lands. This decision forced a massive shift in government policy regarding the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne bands, who remained entirely outside the established reservation boundaries. Inspector Irwin C. Watkins of the Indian Bureau had recently submitted a comprehensive field report detailing the activities of these roaming factions. Watkins argued that the non-compliant bands living in the Powder River country posed a constant physical threat to the established agencies and the advancing white settlements. His report contained a specific recommendation to deploy troops against these independent factions during the winter months. Watkins reasoned that the severe winter weather severely restricted tribal mobility, anchoring them to their camps and making them vulnerable to a coordinated military strike. Grant, Belknap, and Chandler concurred with this aggressive assessment. The administration formulated a plan to issue a strict ultimatum to the independent bands. They would demand that all tribal members report to the government agencies by a specific winter deadline, or be formally declared hostile combatants subject to military force. On December 3, 1875, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Edward P. Smith, sat at his desk and physically drafted the official orders. He dipped his steel pen into black ink and wrote out the directives, sending them via telegraph and postal courier to the Indian agents stationed at the Red Cloud, Spotted Tail, Standing Rock, and Cheyenne River agencies. The written orders instructed the agents to dispatch messengers out into the frozen expanse of the Powder River country without delay. These couriers were tasked with notifying Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other prominent non-reservation leaders of the new government mandate. The dictate stated unequivocally that all individuals must relocate their entire villages to the reservation agencies by January 31, 1876. Failure to comply with this directive would result in the Department of the Interior relinquishing control of the tribes to the War Department, triggering a full-scale military invasion of their hunting grounds. The logistical reality of delivering this ultimatum presented a staggering challenge. The designated agencies were located hundreds of miles away from the secluded winter camps of the roaming bands. The men assigned to carry the message faced brutal, life-threatening environmental conditions. December in the Dakota and Wyoming territories brought plummeting temperatures, frequently dropping to 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Massive weather systems dumped feet of snow across the plains, burying the established trails and filling the deep ravines with impassable drifts. The couriers had to navigate through trackless, freezing expanses entirely devoid of landmarks. At the Standing Rock Agency, officials assembled a specialized group of trusted Native American scouts and seasoned frontiersmen to carry the message westward. At the Red Cloud Agency, similar runner parties were organized and dispatched. The selected men understood the extreme physical risks involved in a deep winter trek. They bundled themselves in thick buffalo hide coats, heavy canvas leggings, and beaver skin caps. They wrapped their faces in thick wool scarves to prevent severe frostbite, though the biting, relentless prairie winds still damaged any exposed skin around their eyes and noses. The messengers packed minimal rations to reduce the weight on their animals. They filled canvas sacks with strips of dried salted beef, hard rock biscuits, and roasted coffee beans. They relied entirely on their physical endurance and intimate knowledge of the regional topography to survive the journey. They rode sturdy, winter-acclimated ponies bred specifically for the harsh plains environment, but the deep snowdrifts exhausted the animals rapidly. The massive caloric deficit caused the horses to lose weight within the first few days of the journey. The physical exertion required to move through the winter landscape proved immense. The messengers frequently had to dismount from their saddles and manually break a trail through waist-deep snow on foot. They waded forward, using their own body weight to compact the drifts, pulling their shivering horses forward step by step through the frozen terrain. Ice crystals formed on the animals' muzzles from their condensed breath, and the sharp crust of the snowpack repeatedly cut into the horses' lower legs, leaving small trails of frozen blood behind them. Finding the roaming bands proved exceedingly difficult in the vast emptiness of the territory. The Lakota and Cheyenne intentionally established their winter camps in highly secluded, sheltered valleys to protect their families and pony herds from the vicious winds. They sought out deep river bends shielded by high bluffs and thick stands of cottonwood trees. The couriers searched painstakingly along the frozen banks of the Powder River, the Tongue River, and the Rosebud Creek, looking for any signs of recent movement. The scouts looked for distinct visual indicators such as the specific tracks left by dragged lodge poles or the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from winter fires miles away. Days turned into weeks as the messengers scoured the vast basin. They survived by digging small trenches into snowbanks for shelter during the coldest nights. They built tiny hidden fires using sparse cottonwood twigs, huddling over the weak flames to thaw their frozen rations, and boil small tin cups of snow for drinking water. When the couriers finally located some of the camps in late December and early January, they entered the villages cautiously. The winter encampments were massive, consisting of hundreds of buffalo hide lodges clustered tightly together for shared warmth. The messengers presented the government demands to the tribal leaders in formal councils. The reception from the indigenous leaders was cold, pragmatic, and entirely dismissive of the Washington directive. Sitting Bull, camped near the mouth of the Powder River, listened quietly to the translated message but flatly refused the demand. Sitting Bull pointed out the obvious physical impossibilities of the government mandate. Moving entire villages across hundreds of miles of frozen plains in the dead of winter guaranteed mass casualties. The elderly, the sick, small children, and pregnant women simply could not survive weeks of exposure in sub-zero temperatures. Furthermore, the tribes relied completely on their massive pony herds for transportation and survival. The horses were currently weak, emaciated, and subsisting on cottonwood tree bark and sparse winter grass scraped from beneath the snow. The animals possessed absolutely zero stamina for a long-distance trek to the agencies. Forcing the horses onto the frozen plains would kill the herd, stranding the people in the snow to freeze to death. Crazy Horse and the Oglala Sioux, camped further south along the winding path of the Tongue River, provided the same practical response. They stated firmly they would not move a single lodge until the spring thaw arrived. The messengers, having fulfilled their strict duty of delivering the message, turned back toward the agencies to report the rejections. They faced the same grueling return journey, battling fresh blizzards that swept down from the Canadian north and plummeted the temperatures even further. The return trek proved even more damaging to the couriers. Their food rations dwindled rapidly. Several men suffered severe frostbite on their extremities. Their fingers and toes lost all feeling, the skin turning a pale, waxy white before darkening into a necrotic black. The constant glare of the winter sun reflecting off the endless snowfields caused severe snow blindness, leaving some men navigating blindly, relying entirely on their horses to follow the trail back east. By the time the battered messengers returned to their respective agencies in the final weeks of January, the political situation had completely solidified. The Indian agents listened to the accounts of the scouts and compiled the responses from the tribal leaders. The agents drafted their final operational reports, confirming in plain language that the roaming bands had no intention of complying with the directive. The tribes would remain in the Powder River country until the snow melted. These written reports traveled back through the bureaucratic chain, moving via telegraph wire from the isolated frontier outposts to the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C. The tone of the government communications shifted swiftly from administrative procedure to impending armed conflict. The civilian authorities recognized the failure of the ultimatum and began preparing the necessary paperwork to transfer control of the situation to the military. The deadline of January 31, 1876 arrived on the calendar. Throughout the Dakota and Wyoming territories, the day passed with absolute silence. No major bands had surrendered. No long lines of frozen Native Americans appeared on the horizon marching toward the agencies. The winter camps remained dispersed throughout the Powder River country, operating precisely as they had for generations. The expiration of the deadline triggered the agreed-upon transfer of authority at the highest levels of the federal government. On February 1, 1876, Secretary of the Interior Chandler formally drafted a letter to Secretary of War Belknap. Chandler stated that the time for peaceful compliance had passed and officially relinquished civilian jurisdiction over the non-reservation Sioux and Cheyenne. He handed the entire matter directly to the United States Army for enforcement. The civilian sector washed its hands of the problem, leaving the resolution to armed cavalrymen and infantry units. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the commanding general of the Army, promptly forwarded the authorization to Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan. Sheridan commanded the vast military division of the Missouri from his heavily fortified headquarters in Chicago. Sheridan had long advocated for aggressive winter campaigns against the Plains tribes. He understood the tactical differences between summer and winter warfare. During the summer months, the Native American warriors were highly mobile, well-mounted, and completely capable of outmaneuvering heavy, slow-moving military columns. In winter, the tactical advantage shifted entirely to the army. The tribes were firmly anchored to their villages, their resources were severely depleted, and their fighting men were restricted by the overriding need to protect their families from the lethal elements. Sheridan transmitted urgent orders to General George Crook, the commander of the Department of the Platte, stationed in Omaha, Nebraska. Crook received direct instructions to organize a large-scale, heavily armed expedition to march north into the Powder River Basin and strike the winter camps without mercy. Crook, a seasoned and hardened veteran of multiple Western conflicts, began marshaling his forces at once. He selected Fort Fetterman as the primary staging ground for the winter campaign. Fort Fetterman sat isolated on a high bluff overlooking the North Platte River in the Wyoming Territory, representing the very edge of military control. The logistics of assembling a massive military strike force in the middle of a brutal winter required relentless, round-the-clock preparation. Trainloads of military supplies began moving west from Omaha along the rails toward the depot at Cheyenne, Wyoming. From the Cheyenne railhead, heavy freight wagons hauled tons of provisions, rifle ammunition, and vital animal forage northward. The wagons rolled over frozen, deeply rutted trails, their wooden wheels cracking loud like rifle shots in the freezing air. The Quartermaster Corps worked frantically to procure enough grain and hay to sustain hundreds of cavalry horses and pack mules. The military planners knew absolutely no natural forage would be available for the animals in the snow-covered plains north of the fort. Troops received orders to converge on Fort Fetterman from various smaller posts scattered across the region. Infantry companies and cavalry troops packed their gear, loaded their weapons, and began the difficult overland march toward the staging area. The soldiers faced the brutal reality of winter travel on the open plains. Enlisted men suffered from frost-bitten skin and debilitating cold exposure during these preliminary marches. To combat the extreme conditions, the Army issued specialized, heavy winter clothing from the quartermaster stores. Soldiers received thick canvas overcoats lined with dense blanket material. They were issued muskrat, fur caps equipped with pull-down ear flaps, thick woolen mittens to protect their trigger fingers, and massive overshoes constructed of heavy felt and buffalo hide designed to be worn directly over their standard-issue leather boots. The Ordnance Department focused entirely on weapon maintenance and ammunition supply. The troops carried the standard-issue Springfield Model 1873 carbines and rifles, utilizing .45 caliber lead bullets in metallic cartridges. The extreme cold weather caused the metal components of the firearms to become highly brittle. The firing mechanisms required careful, constant oiling with specialized lubricants to prevent the internal springs and hammers from freezing solid and jamming during combat. Blacksmiths at Fort Fetterman worked continuously alongside the glowing heat of their forges. They physically fitted hundreds of cavalry horses with specialized winter shoes. These iron shoes were equipped with sharp, protruding steel caulks, welded to the bottom, designed to bite into the ice and packed snow to provide the animals with necessary traction during a charge. Inside the wooden palisade walls of Fort Fetterman, the atmosphere grew incredibly tense with anticipation and the raw misery of the freezing temperatures. The hastily constructed wooden barracks provided minimal shelter against the howling winds that swept violently down from the nearby Laramie Mountains. Large iron stoves burned continuously in the center of the rooms, consuming massive amounts of chopped cordwood just to keep the interior temperatures slightly above the freezing mark. Soldiers spent their days drilling in the deep snow, adjusting the fit of their bulky winter gear and preparing their intricate pack saddle systems for the upcoming march. General Crook arrived personally at the fort to take direct, hands-on command of the expedition. He believed firmly in traveling light and striking fast. Crook preferred to utilize trains of pack mules, rather than relying on heavy, cumbersome supply wagons that would inevitably bog down and stall in the massive northern snowdrifts. He organized his gathered column into a highly mobile force, consisting primarily of seasoned cavalry regiments supported by a few select companies of hardened infantry. The stage was set for a brutal confrontation driven by unyielding policy and merciless weather. March 1, 1876 brought a blinding, violent dawn to the Wyoming Territory. The buglers at Fort Fetterman blew the morning call long before the sun crested the eastern horizon, the brass mouthpieces freezing instantly to their lips and tearing away small patches of bleeding skin when pulled away. Men stumbled from their wooden bunks into a world devoid of warmth, the interior temperature of the barracks having plummeted to 0 overnight. They pulled on their thick canvas outer coats and secured their fur caps, stepping out into a relentless north wind that penetrated their layered clothing. General George Crook stood by the main gate watching his column assemble in the pre-dawn darkness. his breath forming thick clouds of white vapor that crystallized on his coarse beard. Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds commanded the mounted detachment, organizing the men into a strict line of march. 5 companies of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment and 5 companies of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment formed the bulk of the strike force, totaling nearly 700 mounted troopers. These men guided their shivering horses out of the stables, the animals protesting the bitter cold by stamping their iron-shod hooves against the frozen earth. The leather saddles and bridles had turned rigid during the night, forcing the soldiers to physically wrestle the stiff gear onto the backs of their mounts and pull fiercely on the frozen girths. The metal bits required warming inside the men's hands or under their armpits before they could be placed into the horses' mouths to prevent the iron from fusing to the animals' wet tongues. 2 companies of the 4th Infantry Regiment, comprising over 100 men, received the agonizing task of marching on foot. These foot soldiers acted as the primary guards for the pack train, bringing up the rear of the expedition. They wore thick winter footwear over their boots, carrying their long Springfield rifles slung across their shoulders. The infantrymen faced the daunting prospect of walking hundreds of miles through deep, shifting snowdrifts, relying on their own physical stamina. Every step required immense exertion, lifting their snow-caked boots high into the air to clear the crust, only to sink knee-deep again with the next stride. The physical toll on their leg muscles and joints began the moment they left the protective walls of the fort. Chief Packer Thomas Moore orchestrated the movement of the supply train, a chaotic assembly of 300 pack mules. Moore and his crew of civilian handlers worked frantically to secure the loads, cinching the canvas and leather straps tight around the mules' bellies, often suffering rope burns on their raw hands. The animals carried thousands of pounds of essential provisions, including hard bread, salt pork, unroasted coffee beans, and vital sacks of grain for the cavalry horses. The mules brayed loudly, resisting the weight and the freezing wind, kicking out at the packers in the staging area. The handlers used leather whips and loud shouts to force the unruly herd into a single file line, preparing them for the brutal trek ahead. The wooden gates of Fort Fetterman swung open wide, and the vanguard of the column marched forward into the unforgiving Wyoming landscape. As the soldiers moved away from the meager protection of the fort's structures, the true severity of the ambient temperature hit them. The thermometer registered 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the wind chill drove the perceived temperature down much further. The landscape rolling out before them was a vast expanse of blinding white snow, broken only by the dark, skeletal branches of leafless cottonwood trees lining the riverbanks. The column stretched out for over a mile, a dark line of men and animals cutting a deep, churned trench through the pristine winter snowpack. The first major obstacle lay ahead at the crossing of the North Platte River. The wide waterway had frozen solid over the winter, presenting a flat but treacherous sheet of thick blue ice covered by a thin layer of blown snow. General Crook ordered the cavalry to cross first, instructing the men to dismount and pull their horses by the reins to distribute the weight across the frozen expanse. The horses stepped onto the ice with extreme hesitation, their iron winter caulks scraping and gouging the slick surface. The sound of sharp cracking echoed loudly across the river valley, causing the animals to panic and thrash sideways, slipping and falling onto their flanks and knees. Troopers struggled desperately to keep their mounts upright, pulling hard on the leather reins while trying to maintain their own footing on the treacherous surface. Several horses went down hard, their bodies slamming against the ice, resulting in severe lacerations on their legs and deep contusions on their shoulders. The men had to physically lift the animals, shouting commands and dragging them forward, until they reached the snow-covered banks on the northern side. The infantry and the pack mules followed, the hooves of the mules pitting the ice further, making the crossing increasingly dangerous for those at the very rear of the long procession. Once across the river, the column entered an open, barren plain devoid of any natural windbreaks. The northern gale blasted relentlessly against the soldiers, driving sharp, crystalline snow directly into their faces. The men pulled their scarves up over their noses and pulled their fur caps down low, leaving only narrow slits for their eyes. Even with these precautions, the constant exposure to the freezing wind caused the skin on their cheeks and foreheads to turn a raw, angry red before shifting to a dangerous pale white. The men lost feeling in their extremities rapidly, their fingers growing numb and useless inside their woolen mittens. The cavalry horses bore the brunt of the physical labor, forced to break the trail through drifts. When the vanguard animals faltered, they were cycled to the rear and fresh horses moved up to continue the grueling work of plowing through the snowpack. This constant exertion drained the animals' stamina rapidly, forcing them to burn through their limited caloric reserves within the first few miles of the journey. The infantrymen marching behind the cavalry faced a different kind of torture. They walked directly inside the deep, uneven trenches created by the hundreds of horses that had passed before them. The snow inside these tracks was churned, loosely packed, and filled with jagged chunks of compressed ice. The foot soldiers stumbled constantly, twisting their ankles and straining their knees as they navigated the ruined trail. Their winter footwear provided some warmth but offered terrible ankle support, resulting in numerous sprains and deep muscle cramps as they fought to keep pace with the mounted units pulling ahead of them. Any equipment containing moisture froze solid within the first hour of the march. The metal canteens slung over the soldiers' shoulders turned into blocks of ice, rendering the water inside inaccessible. The men could not drink to replace the fluids lost through their physical exertion. The sweat generated by their labor wicked outward through their inner layers of wool, freezing instantly when it met the freezing air penetrating their coats. This created a rigid shell of ice directly against their bodies, sapping their core temperatures and inducing violent, uncontrollable shivering fits. The column moved strictly along the invisible, snow-covered path of the old Bozeman Trail. The scouts rode far out on the flanks, searching the desolate terrain for the familiar geographic markers indicating the correct route north. They looked for specific rock formations, the curvature of frozen creek beds, and the distant silhouettes of prominent ridges. The landscape offered no visual comfort, presenting only an endless rolling expanse of white snow that merged seamlessly with the pale, overcast sky. The total lack of contrast caused severe visual disorientation among the men, a condition exacerbated by the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the icy crust. By midday, the wind intensity increased exponentially, howling across the open plains with a physical force that visibly pushed against the men and animals. The violent gusts kicked up the loose surface snow, creating localized whiteouts that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. The column tightened its formation, the soldiers riding knee to knee to avoid losing sight of the men directly in front of them. Communication became impossible as the roaring wind drowned out the sound of shouting voices and the thud of thousands of hooves striking the frozen ground. Scout Frank Gruard rode near the front of the column, scanning the horizon through narrowed eyes. Gruard possessed unparalleled knowledge of the northern terrain, having lived directly among the Sioux bands for several years prior to the conflict. He understood how to read the subtle, hidden signs of the winter plains, recognizing the differences between naturally drifted snow and snow disturbed by the passage of a large group. Beside him rode Baptiste Poirier, known as Big Bat, another seasoned frontiersman who scrutinized every distant ridgeline and frozen valley for any indication of an encampment. Despite the intense scrutiny of the scouts, the vast landscape remained empty and devoid of tracks. The unrelenting blizzards of the previous weeks had erased any potential signs of movement, filling in trail depressions and burying any discarded items under feet of fresh powder. The scouts navigated primarily by memory and instinct, guiding the military force toward the major river drainages where they knew the tribes must be seeking shelter. The slow, grinding pace of the march meant they covered only a fraction of the distance they could have achieved on dry, solid ground. As late afternoon approached, the pale sun dropped low toward the western horizon, and the temperature plummeted even further. The thermometer carried by the expedition surgeon registered 30 degrees below zero. The officers recognized the dire necessity of finding a suitable campsite before total darkness enveloped the column. A night caught out on the open, wind-swept plains would result in numerous casualties from exposure. The commanders scanned the bleak terrain, desperately searching for any topographical depression, ravine, or dry creek bed that might offer even a fraction of protection from the lethal, continuous northern gale. Groard located a slight, shallow depression near the frozen banks of Sage Creek, offering a minuscule windbreak behind a low rise of earth. Crook signaled the halt, and the column slowly ground to a stop. The chaotic process of making a winter camp commenced. The men dismounted, their stiff, frozen legs barely supporting their weight as their boots hit the snow. They began the agonizing labor of stamping down the waist-deep drifts, creating flat, compacted areas large enough to lay down their bedrolls. General Crook had forbidden the use of heated canvas tents to reduce the overall pack train load, leaving the men exposed to the elements. Small details of soldiers fanned out across the frozen creek bed, desperately searching for any available fuel. They hacked at the sparse, brittle sagebrush with their knives and used axes to chop dead, frozen branches from the few stunted cottonwood trees lining the banks. The wood was frozen and coated in ice, making it incredibly difficult to ignite. The men huddled closely together, using their own bodies to block the fierce wind while they struck matches with numb, fumbling fingers, trying repeatedly to coax a spark onto small piles of dry grass pulled from beneath the snow. Tiny, smoke-filled fires eventually flickered to life across the campsite, providing very little actual heat but offering a necessary psychological boost. The soldiers placed their frozen canteens and small tin cups filled with packed snow over the weak flames, waiting agonizingly for the ice to melt into drinkable water. The smoke from the sagebrush fires burned their eyes and filled their lungs, causing violent coughing fits, but they refused to step away from the meager warmth. The men took turns standing directly over the flames, rotating their bodies slowly in a futile attempt to thaw their frozen clothing and numb extremities. The pack mules and cavalry horses required attention before the soldiers could rest. The handlers unloaded the supply packs from the mules, the animals visibly relieved to be free of the crushing weight. The cavalrymen removed the saddles from their mounts, vigorously rubbing down the horses' sweating coats with rough burlap sacks to prevent the moisture from freezing solid against their skin. The quartermasters distributed the strictly rationed grain, dumping small piles of oats directly onto the snow for the animals to consume. The horses and mules ate ravenously, desperate for the calories needed to survive the freezing night. After securing the animals, the men turned to their own frozen rations. The hard bread, normally tough to chew, had become rock solid in the cold. The soldiers used the brass butt plates of their Springfield rifles to smash the biscuits into smaller, swallowable pieces. The salted bacon carried in canvas sacks was frozen and impossible to slice with a knife. The men hacked off rough chunks and held them directly over the sagebrush fires on the ends of wooden sticks, charring the outside while the center remained raw and frozen. They ate the unappetizing food out of pure necessity, washing it down with scalding, bitter coffee brewed from melted snow. Total darkness fell over the Wyoming plains and the temperature reached its lowest point. The wind howled relentlessly through the low depression, ripping away the heat generated by the small fires. The men realized the extreme danger of falling asleep in these conditions. To lie down on the frozen ground and close their eyes invited hypothermia and death. To combat this, the soldiers formed small groups and spent the night pacing continuously back and forth through the compacted snow. They stomped their boots, clapped their thick mittens together, and kept each other awake through sheer willpower and constant physical motion. The assigned camp guards faced the most brutal duty of the night. Picketed on the exposed outer edges of the camp, they stood alone in the pitch blackness, staring out into the empty, howling void. Their canvas overcoats offered little protection against the wind that battered their bodies relentlessly. They listened intently for any sound out of the ordinary, straining to hear over the continuous roar of the gale and the restless stamping of hundreds of freezing animals behind them. The guards stamped their feet continuously, fighting the overwhelming urge to seek the meager warmth of the campfires. Morning of March 2nd, 1876 arrived without any visible sunrise, the sky remaining a dull, flat, menacing gray. The soldiers who had managed to catch a few moments of exhausted sleep woke up buried under thick drifts of blown snow. They rose stiffly, shaking off the white powder, their muscles cramped and their joints aching from the severe cold. Many men discovered fresh frostbite on their faces and hands, the skin pale and devoid of feeling. The hospital stewards moved through the camp, applying coats of iodine and wrapping the damaged flesh in linen bandages, though there was nothing they could do to reverse the tissue damage. The process of breaking camp mirrored the misery of the previous morning. The leather saddles, having been removed from the horses, were once again frozen solid into rigid, unyielding shapes. The men fought to force the stiff leather over the backs of their shivering mounts, their bare hands sticking painfully to the freezing metal buckles and rings. The horses stomped and sidestepped, agitated by the cold and the rough handling, making the saddling process incredibly difficult and dangerous. The pack mules brayed continuously, resisting the loads being strapped back onto their sore, bruised backs. General Crook gave the order to mount up, and the column resumed its slow, agonizing march northward. Their destination was the ruined site of Fort Reno, an abandoned military post situated further up the old Bozeman Trail. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they pushed deeper into the territory, the flat plains giving way to steep, snow-choked ravines and high, jagged ridges. The cavalry horses struggled even more than the previous day, their energy reserves severely depleted by the freezing night and the lack of adequate forage. The foot soldiers of the 4th Infantry marched grimly behind the horses, their faces set in expressions of pure, stoic endurance. The deep tracks from the previous day had filled with fresh blowing snow overnight, forcing the men to break trail all over again. The physical strain intensified with every mile, the footwear feeling like iron anvils strapped to their feet. The constant rubbing of the stiff fabric against their skin caused raw, bleeding abrasions on their thighs and waists, compounding the misery of the freezing temperatures and the biting wind. The landscape around them offered absolutely no variation, remaining a hostile, desolate void of white and gray. The pale sun provided no warmth, serving only as a harsh, glaring source of light that amplified the intense reflection off the snowpack. The men suffered from severe snow blindness, their eyes watering constantly, the vision becoming blurred and agonizingly painful. Some soldiers tore strips of dark cloth from their shirts and tied them over their eyes, relying solely on the man directly in front of them to guide their steps through the blinding wilderness. The scouts continued to range far ahead, their tough prairie ponies pushing through the drifts with practiced ease. Groard and Big Bat searched diligently for any sign of a winter camp, looking for the telltale signs of chopped wood or the distinct tracks of drag poles. The complete absence of these signs confirmed the vast, empty nature of the Powder River Basin. The Native American bands were hidden deep, utilizing the rugged topography to shield their villages from the brutal weather and the prying eyes of the military columns sent to hunt them down. As the second day of the march wore on, the sheer isolation and brutal reality of the expedition settled firmly onto the shoulders of every man in the column. They were hundreds of miles away from any form of civilization, moving deeper into hostile, unmapped territory during the most dangerous season of the year. The freezing wind, the deep snow, and the physical exhaustion were lethal enemies, long before they would ever encounter a single warrior. The march from Fort Fetterman had only just begun, and the extreme limits of human endurance were already being violently tested. March 16th, 1876. The primary military column halted its forward movement near the frozen, timber-strewn headwaters of Otter Creek. The sky overhead remained a featureless, oppressive gray shield, trapping the freezing air close to the valley floor. General George Crook sat atop his large cavalry mount, surveying the rugged terrain stretching toward the east. The horses stamped their iron-shod hooves into the hard-packed ice, expelling thick plumes of white vapor from their flared nostrils. The soldiers waited in formation, their bodies numb from the continuous exposure to the subzero temperatures. The men kept their arms tucked tightly against their rib cages, trying to preserve whatever residual warmth remained trapped inside their wool shirts. The expedition's chief scout, Frank Gruard, rode into the center of the halted column, his prairie pony breathing heavily from a rapid return trip. Gruard dismounted stiffly, his canvas leggings caked with frozen mud and ice crystals gathered from brushing against the deep drifts. He approached General Crook and the surrounding staff officers, requesting a briefing without delay. Gruard reported a critical discovery found during his forward reconnaissance sweep across the nearby ridgelines. He had located 2 sets of fresh hoofprints cutting directly through the undisturbed powder on the eastern slope. The scout traced the path in the air with his gloved hand to illustrate the trajectory. The tracks belonged to unshod ponies, a definitive indicator of Native American presence in the vicinity. The sharp indentations in the snowpack showed the horses were moving at a fast trot, heading eastward over the high, jagged divide. Gruard explained that the distinct pattern of the prints suggested the riders were hunters carrying heavy loads of fresh meat back to their families. This specific detail meant a winter encampment had to be located nearby, likely sheltering within the winding timbered valley of the Powder River, situated just over the adjacent mountain range. The men had been searching for this specific sign since leaving the fort weeks prior. General Crook processed this intelligence rapidly and convened a field council with his senior officers right on the snow-covered riverbank. He unrolled a heavily creased topographical map, the brittle paper cracking audibly in the freezing air. The commanders analyzed the immense physical challenge of crossing the steep mountainous divide separating their current position from the suspected village location. The terrain consisted of vertical rock faces, narrow, ice-choked ravines, and unpredictable, unstable snow cornices hanging over deep drop-offs. The elevation gain required to clear the pass would test the physical limits of every soldier in the command. The officers concluded unanimously that the slow-moving pack train could not traverse the treacherous incline. The 300 burdened mules and the accompanying foot soldiers of the 4th Infantry would inevitably stall the pursuit, creating a bottleneck on the narrow mountain trails. Dragging the supply apparatus over the divide would generate loud noise, alerting any sentries stationed on the high ground and ruining the element of surprise required for a successful military assault on the village. The mules frequently brayed when pushed past their endurance, a sound that would carry for miles across the silent snow-covered peaks. Crook made a firm tactical decision to divide his forces. He issued direct orders to separate the mobile cavalry units from the cumbersome logistical tail. The general himself would remain behind with the infantrymen and the pack mules. This rear echelon received instructions to remain back with the supply train, awaiting further developments. The primary objective of striking the enemy village would fall entirely upon a detached, fast-moving strike force capable of navigating the rugged alpine environment without the burden of supply wagons and slow-foot soldiers dragging behind them. Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds received the direct command of this newly formed pursuit detachment. Reynolds, a veteran cavalry officer with decades of frontier experience, began selecting the specific units for the dangerous mission. He chose 2 complete battalions, drawing 3 companies from the 2nd Cavalry Regiment and 3 companies from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. This selection created a combined fighting force of nearly 400 armed mounted troopers, ready to transition to an aggressive offensive posture. The selected men were ordered to step forward from the main formation, separating themselves from the men destined for the base camp. Reynolds issued strict, uncompromising orders regarding the equipment allowed on the mission. Speed and total silence were the primary requirements for catching the fleeing hunters and locating the hidden camp. The colonel commanded his troopers to strip their saddles of all, would ride into the freezing mountains carrying only the clothing currently worn on their bodies. The goal was to reduce the burden on the horses as much as possible, prioritizing swift travel over basic human comfort. The logistical restrictions extended strictly to their food and ammunition supplies. Each selected cavalryman received permission to carry only 1 single day of hard rations inside their leather saddlebags. These rations consisted solely of hard rock biscuits and raw, unsalted pork fat wrapped in canvas. For weaponry, the men carried their standard-issue Springfield carbines and Colt revolvers, along with 100 rounds of metallic cartridges secured tightly in their canvas web belts. No reserve ammunition crates would accompany the strike force, meaning every shot fired during the upcoming engagement had to find its intended target to prevent the detachment from running dry. The physical separation of the military column commenced on the riverbank. The selected cavalry troopers dismounted and began unbuckling the heavy leather straps, securing their winter gear to their McClellan saddles. They handed over their thick blankets and extra provisions to the quartermaster staying behind with the pack train. The men shivered violently as they removed their outer layers, fully aware they were committing themselves to a brutal, unsheltered night march. Through high-altitude, sub-zero terrain, the pile of discarded gear grew rapidly in the snow, a stark visual representation of the sacrifice demanded by the impending forced march. The atmosphere among the chosen men grew tense and quiet. They checked the actions of their firearms, ensuring the metal breeches were clear of ice and functioning smoothly. They tightened their saddle girths, preparing their mounts for the grueling physical exertion ahead. The horses, stripped of the extra weight, seemed agitated by the sudden change, tossing their heads and fighting the iron bits in their mouths. The troopers stood beside their animals, holding the stiff leather reins, waiting for the final command to advance. The sun offered no warmth, serving only as a pale disk behind the relentless gray cloud cover sweeping over the valley. By mid-afternoon, the sky darkened considerably as a new storm system pushed in from the northern plains. The wind intensity increased, violently shaking the bare branches of the cottonwood trees and driving sharp ice crystals horizontally across the valley floor. Colonel Reynolds mounted his horse and moved to the front of the assembled detachment. He gave a silent hand signal, pumping his arm forward once. The 400 cavalrymen mounted up in unison, the creak of freezing leather echoing loudly across the clearing. The strike force turned away from the main column, initiating their lonely journey into the hostile wilderness. The strike force left the temporary security of the Tongue River Basin, turning their horses directly east toward the towering snow-covered mass of the Divide. Frank Gruar and his small team of civilian scouts took the point position, riding several hundred yards ahead of the main body. They focused intently on the faint, shallow indentations left by the 2 unshod ponies, reading the subtle disturbances in the snow crust to determine the specific route taken by the hunters earlier that morning. The scouts rode low in their saddles, scanning the horizon for any signs of an ambush waiting in the high rocks. The terrain angled upward almost at once. The column moved out of the flat riverbed and entered a narrow, twisting canyon flanked by sheer, vertical rock walls. The floor of the canyon was filled with jagged boulders hidden beneath deep, unstable snowdrifts. The horses struggled to find secure footing, their iron calks slipping off the slick stone surfaces. The animals lunged forward, using immense bursts of energy to clear the obstacles, their chest muscles straining heavily under the physical demand. The riders leaned forward, grabbing handfuls of mane to keep themselves seated securely as the mounts lurched upward over the treacherous terrain. As the detachment climbed higher into the mountain pass, the temperature plummeted dramatically. The thick, gray clouds lowered, enveloping the high peaks and obscuring any remaining ambient daylight. The heavy snowfall intensified, reducing forward visibility to a mere 30 yards. The large, wet flakes clung to the men's wool uniforms, quickly freezing into a solid, restrictive layer of external ice. The riders hunched forward over their saddlebows, desperately trying to protect their faces from the relentless, freezing wind. The snow quickly accumulated on the brims of their hats, forcing them to constantly brush the heavy powder away to maintain their line of sight. Total darkness engulfed the column long before they reached the summit of the divide. The officers passed strict orders down the line, requiring absolute silence from every man. The troopers were forbidden from speaking, striking matches, or allowing their equipment to rattle. The men communicated through physical touch, reaching out to grasp the shoulder of the rider next to them to maintain the tight, close-knit formation. The only sounds permitted were the heavy, labored breathing of the exhausted horses and the crunching of snow beneath their hooves. The darkness transformed the landscape into a disorienting, featureless void of swirling white and deep shadows. The fresh snowfall threatened to obliterate the crucial tracks they were following. Gruard realized he could no longer see the indentations from the saddle. He dismounted from his pony and proceeded on foot, walking at the very front of the column. The scout got down on his hands and knees in the freezing powder, removing his thick mittens to physically feel the texture of the snowpack. He dragged his bare fingers across the surface, searching for the compacted ice layers indicating the passage of the heavy pony hooves. This painstaking process slowed the advance to a crawl, but losing the trail meant failing the mission entirely. The physical toll of riding without winter coats or blankets became agonizing for the cavalrymen. The subzero cold penetrated their thin wool shirts and trousers effortlessly, leaching the body heat directly from their core. The soldiers experienced violent, uncontrollable muscle spasms as their bodies fought desperately to generate warmth. They stomped their booted feet against the wooden stirrups to keep the blood circulating into their lower extremities, a futile effort against the overwhelming freezing environment surrounding them. The metal canteens slung across their chests turned into solid blocks of ice, pressing painfully against their ribs with every lurch of their mounts. Severe frostbite began to claim the exposed flesh of the troopers. Men lost all sensation in their noses, cheeks, and earlobes. The skin turned a waxy, translucent white, indicating the cellular fluid was freezing solid. The moisture from their condensed breath formed thick, heavy icicles on their mustaches and beards, pulling painfully at the skin of their faces. The horses suffered equally, their muzzles coated in thick layers of frost, their eyelashes frozen shut by the blowing snow. The animals required constant prodding from the riders' spurs to keep moving upward against the relentless gale pushing down from the summit. The column finally crested the high ridge of the divide near midnight. The exposure on the summit was absolute. The wind howled relentlessly across the barren rock face, hitting the men with a raw, physical force that threatened to blow the riders out of their saddles. The troopers leaned heavily into the gale, using their own body weight to keep their horses stabilized on the narrow, treacherous path. There was no shelter available, only a vast, howling darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. The thin air at that altitude burned their lungs with every labored breath, compounding the sheer misery of the freezing temperatures. The downward descent onto the eastern slope proved far more dangerous than the upward climb. The angle of the trail was incredibly steep, dropping sharply into an unseen black void. The path consisted of loose, unstable shale rock hidden entirely beneath a thick layer of blue ice. The horses locked their front legs, refusing to step forward onto the slick surface. The riders had to dismount again, grabbing the leather cheek pieces of the bridles and physically dragging the terrified animals downward. The descent required a delicate balance of force and caution, knowing a single misstep would result in a catastrophic fall down the mountain. Gravity pulled fiercely at the men and horses. The animals slipped constantly, their hindquarters sliding sideways out of control. Several horses lost their footing entirely, tumbling heavily down the steep embankments. The heavy bodies slammed against the jagged rocks and thick pine trunks, snapping legs and crushing ribs with sickening cracks. The troopers had no time to assess the damage or retrieve the fallen animals. They simply cut the reins and kept moving downward, leaving the crippled horses to die in the snow. The loss of a mount meant a soldier now had to walk the remainder of the brutal journey on foot. The men struggled frantically to maintain their own balance on the treacherous decline. The heavy leather soles of their cavalry boots offered zero traction on the ice. Soldiers slipped and fell repeatedly, tearing their uniforms on the sharp rocks and sustaining deep, bleeding lacerations on their hands and knees. The blood froze instantly upon contact with the air, binding the torn fabric directly to their raw, open wounds. They scrambled back to their feet quickly, terrified of being left behind in the pitch-black wilderness. The relentless pace set by the officers offered no opportunity to bind wounds or check for broken bones. The extreme physical exertion and the total lack of food severely drained the energy reserves of the entire detachment. The men had consumed their single day of rations hours earlier, leaving them running entirely on adrenaline and sheer willpower. The hunger gnawed viciously at their stomachs, compounding the misery of the freezing temperatures and the grueling physical labor. They scooped up handfuls of snow, letting it melt in their mouths in a desperate attempt to combat their severe dehydration. The melted snow provided no caloric value, serving only to further lower their core body temperatures from the inside out. Gruard continued his slow, meticulous tracking process, guiding the column downward through a series of twisting, interlocking ravines. The scout relied heavily on his internal compass and his deep instinctual knowledge of the regional topography. He knew these drainages eventually emptied directly into the main Powder River Valley. The tracks of the two hunters remained barely discernible, a faint depression in the snow guiding them deeper into the hostile, unmapped territory. The men followed the scout blindly, trusting their lives entirely to his ability to read the subtle changes in the landscape hidden beneath the darkness and the driving snow. The hours dragged on in a continuous blur of physical pain and mind-numbing cold. The officers rode up and down the long line of marching men, using hushed, harsh whispers to keep the troopers awake and moving. Falling asleep in the saddle meant certain death from hypothermia. When a man began to slump over the neck of his horse, the rider next to him would reach out and strike him hard on the shoulder, jolting him back to painful consciousness. The brutal method of maintaining alertness saved lives, preventing the exhausted soldiers from surrendering to the overwhelming urge to close their eyes and rest. The narrow ravines eventually began to widen, the steep rocky walls slowly giving way to gentler rolling slopes. The thick stands of pine trees thinned out, replaced by scattered clusters of bare cottonwoods and thick brush. The men sensed the subtle change in the terrain, recognizing they were nearing the bottom of the long, agonizing descent. The wind intensity decreased slightly as they entered the sheltered confines of the lower basin, providing a minuscule fraction of relief from the relentless gale. The horses stopped fighting the bits, sensing the transition from the treacherous mountain pass to the relatively flat ground of the valley floor. The scouts halted the column momentarily, signaling for the officers to move forward. Gruard pointed down toward the dark, winding line of the frozen riverbed visible in the distance. The scent of wood smoke hung faintly in the frigid air, trapped close to the ground by the heavy atmospheric pressure. This olfactory evidence confirmed their suspicions. A large number of fires were burning somewhere further down the valley, hidden by the bends of the river and the thick timber. The smell of burning wood brought a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline to the freezing men, fully awakening them to the impending danger resting below. Reynolds ordered the men to secure their horses and prepare their weapons for action. The troopers dismounted, their bodies stiff and uncooperative after hours of freezing in the saddle. They checked their Springfield carbines again in the dark, ensuring the metal mechanisms were free of ice. They pulled the heavy leather flap holsters covering their Colt revolvers, ensuring the sidearms were loose and easily accessible. The tension in the air was palpable, replacing the exhaustion with a sharp, adrenaline-fueled focus. The men wiped the frost from the iron sights of their rifles, knowing the time, for silent marching had officially ended. The strike force resumed its silent, creeping advance along the edge of the frozen river. The men moved strictly on foot now, guiding their horses by the reins to minimize any noise. They navigated through the dense underbrush, their eyes straining to pierce the thick gloom of the early morning hours. The detachment had successfully crossed the treacherous divide and located the target area, positioning themselves perfectly for the impending confrontation. As the long, brutal night finally began to give way to the approaching dawn, the stage was set for the violence they had endured the freezing march to deliver upon the unsuspecting camp. March 17th, 1876 arrived with a pale, diluted gray light, filtering slowly through the dense canopy of the Powder River Valley. The overcast sky hung incredibly low, pressing a heavy, freezing fog against the deep canyon floor. 400 exhausted cavalrymen huddled tightly in the dense timber along the eastern ridge, their bodies completely stiff from the brutal night march over the high divide. The troopers stood silently beside their shivering mounts, gripping the frozen leather reins with numb, unresponsive fingers. Visibility expanded inch by slow inch as the darkness retreated, revealing the rugged, uneven topography of the surrounding basin and the jagged peaks towering above them. Chief Scout Frank Gruard and his counterpart Baptiste Poirier left the main body of soldiers behind. The two seasoned frontiersmen dropped flat onto their stomachs in the deep, undisturbed snowpack. They crawled forward, utilizing their elbows and knees, dragging themselves forcefully through the thick, brittle sagebrush toward the precipice of a commanding bluff. The sharp ice crystals tore relentlessly at their canvas trousers and scraped the outer layers of skin from their knuckles. They moved with calculated caution, ensuring not a single loose rock tumbled down the steep embankment to betray their elevated position to anyone waiting below in the frigid valley. Reaching the absolute edge of the cliff, Gruard brushed a thick layer of white frost from his eyebrows and peered intently over the rocky rim. The sight below confirmed their worst fears and greatest tactical hopes simultaneously. A massive Native American encampment occupied the flat bottomland situated on the western bank of the winding frozen river. More than 100 large buffalo hide lodges stood erected in a sprawling, highly disorganized line following the natural curvature of the watercourse. The sheer scale of the settlement indicated a combined population of roughly 800 individuals currently occupying the isolated valley, completely unaware of the looming threat resting on the ridge. The dwellings were heavily fortified against the severe winter environment. Thick layers of packed snow banked high against the outer bases of the conical structures, providing crucial life-saving insulation against the biting northern gales. Faint, thin columns of gray smoke spiraled upward from the open flaps at the apex of numerous lodges, confirming the inhabitants were present and maintaining small interior fires. The camp layout utilized the surrounding topography perfectly, heavily sheltered by towering leafless cottonwood trees and flanked on the western side by a series of steep, impassable rocky terraces that offered a formidable natural wall against the bitter elements. South of the main lodge cluster, occupying a wide, elevated plateau, stood the primary source of the tribe's mobility and vast wealth. An immense pony herd numbering nearly 1,000 animals grazed peacefully among the sparse, frozen timber. The massive collection of horses stood huddled closely together in tight, overlapping groups, utilizing their shared body heat to survive the sub-zero dawn. Stripping the camp of these mounts would cripple their ability to hunt, fight, or flee the incoming military offensive. The animals dug at the snow with their hooves, searching desperately for any remaining tufts of dry prairie grass hidden beneath the crust to sustain their massive body weight through the punishing winter. Several young boys wrapped entirely in thick animal skins walked slowly among the herd, serving as early morning sentries. These youthful guards remained entirely oblivious to the heavily armed strike force watching them closely from the eastern ridge. They stamped their moccasin-clad feet against the frozen earth to maintain circulation, blowing warm breath into their cupped hands. The wind carried their faint voices up the slope, a stark reminder of the human element resting directly in the crosshairs of the impending military operation poised to strike their peaceful encampment. Gruard scrutinized the specific construction methods and decorative markings distinctly visible on the exterior hides of the closest dwellings. The unique geometric patterns painted in red and black ochre allowed him to identify the specific bands currently occupying the settlement. He recognized the heavy presence of Oglala Sioux, identifying the specific sub-band led by Chief Dog. Intermingled closely with the Oglala lodges were the highly distinctive structures belonging to the northern Cheyenne, heavily influenced by the leadership of Two Moons. This combined presence meant a highly formidable, experienced fighting force slept within the village perimeters, resting their weapons securely beside their sleeping furs. Based on the total count of erected lodges, the scout calculated the defensive military strength of the sleeping camp. He estimated the presence of at least 250 seasoned warriors, men heavily experienced in plains warfare and intimately familiar with the surrounding defensive terrain. While the cavalry possessed a slight numerical advantage, the soldiers were physically depleted, entirely starving, and currently operating deep inside hostile territory without any possibility of quick reinforcement. The impending engagement would rely on the absolute shock and sudden violence of a coordinated, multi-directional surprise assault designed to shatter their sense of security. Having gathered the critical intelligence, Gruard and Poirier slid slowly backward away from the precipice. They kept their bodies pressed completely flat against the snow until they retreated far enough behind the crest to avoid any visual detection from the valley floor. Once clear of the direct sight line, the two men stood up and rapidly descended the backside of the ridge, returning quickly to the concealed ravine where the strike force waited in agonizing silence. The snow crunched softly beneath their footwear as they navigated the treacherous footing, moving swiftly to initiate the final lethal phases of the battle plan. Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds stood leaning heavily against the saddle of his large bay gelding. The veteran officer suffered intensely from the extreme cold, his joints completely stiffened by the lack of heavy winter clothing. His face was drawn and pale, reflecting the severe physical toll of the previous 24 hours. Gruard delivered his report in a hushed, highly urgent whisper, detailing the location of the village, the estimated number of hostile fighters, and the precise positioning of the massive pony herd currently grazing heavily on the southern plateau under the watchful eyes of the young herders. Reynolds summoned his battalion and company commanders to a highly secure location. Captains James R. Egan, Henry Noyes, Alexander Moore, and Anson Mills gathered in a tight, quiet circle behind a large outcropping of gray granite. The seasoned officers knelt in the frozen powder, their breath forming rapid clouds of thick white vapor as they leaned in close to hear the tactical briefing. The men kept their movements minimal, preserving every ounce of body heat while focusing intently on the commander's upcoming instructions that would determine the survival or destruction of their entire command. Reynolds used a broken cottonwood twig to draw a rudimentary map in the surface snow, outlining the curvature of the Powder River, the specific location of the lodges and the steep western bluffs dominating the rear of the settlement. The crude diagram served as the only visual aid for the most critical military engagement of the campaign, etched fleetingly into the winter landscape. The captain studied the drawn lines carefully, committing the geographical layout to memory, knowing the snow would soon be trampled into muddy slush by thousands of charging hooves and heavy leather boots. The commanding colonel devised a complex, multi-pronged offensive strategy expressly designed to overwhelm the camp before the resident warriors could mount an organized, effective defense. The primary, absolute overriding objective of the military operation was the physical capture and removal of the enemy pony herd. Stripping the tribes of their horses would neutralize their vast mobility, preventing any mass escape and rendering them entirely vulnerable to the lethal winter elements. Reynolds stressed heavily to his subordinates that securing the animals took absolute tactical precedence over destroying the physical structures of the village or engaging the warriors in prolonged combat. Reynolds pointed the small twig directly at the southern edge of his crude snow map. He assigned Captain James R. Egan the most dangerous and highly direct role in the upcoming military operation. Egan would take his specific company of 47 seasoned men, form them into a tight single line of battle and execute a high-speed mounted cavalry charge directly into the chaotic center of the lodge cluster. This violent frontal assault was expressly designed to create massive panic, driving the shocked inhabitants forcefully out of their dwellings and pushing them rapidly northward into the freezing river. Captain Henry Noyes received orders to closely follow Egan's charging column. While Egan engaged the warriors among the structures, Noyes would utilize his specific company to sweep aggressively across the elevated southern plateau. His troopers were tasked with entirely surrounding the massive pony herd, cutting off any natural escape routes, and driving the herd violently away from the village and into the possession of the military. Noyes' men prepared their thick braided lariats, knowing the physical capture of the frightened animals would require intense, high-speed maneuvers across highly uneven ground filled with hidden badger holes and slick patches of ice. The complex tactical plan required heavy supporting fire from elevated positions to adequately cover the cavalry charge. Reynolds directed Captain Alexander Moore to take his full battalion, consisting of 2 complete companies, and dismount. Moore's soldiers would leave their horses behind under heavy guard and proceed strictly on foot. Their specific objective was to hike rapidly up the treacherous, ice-covered slopes of the steep western terraces flanking the camp. From this commanding high ground, they would pour continuous plunging rifle fire directly into the village, preventing the waking warriors from establishing defensive positions along the rocky ridges to fire down upon the vulnerable cavalrymen. Captain Anson Mills received command of the heavily armed reserve battalion. His mounted troopers would trail the primary assault forces closely, standing ready to deploy rapidly wherever the close-quarters fighting became the most intense. Mills was also expressly instructed to maneuver his men toward the northern perimeter of the encampment, effectively sealing off the only remaining flat exit from the valley floor. If the complex, multi-pronged maneuver executed correctly, The entire population would be securely trapped within a rapidly tightening ring of charging horses and suppressing crossfire, leaving them no viable avenue of retreat. The intricate coordination of the assault required highly precise timing. The standard military use of brass bugles to signal the charge was strictly forbidden, as the loud, echoing notes would alert the sleeping camp to the impending danger. Instead, the officers synchronized their metal pocket watches down to the minute. They agreed upon a specific, unalterable time for Egan to initiate the rapid downhill gallop. The other commanders would base their respective aggressive movements entirely on the visual cue of Egan's men breaking from the timber and hitting the flat bottomland to commence the brutal engagement. The captains broke the council and returned to their individual units to distribute the final orders. The non-commissioned officers moved quietly down the long lines of shivering men, whispering the complex instructions directly into the ears of the waiting troopers. These soldiers responded with grim, silent nods of complete understanding. They checked the mechanical actions of their breech-loading .45 caliber carbines one final time, ensuring the moving steel parts were free of solid ice and capable of firing accurately into the chaos of the waking village. Reaching into their canvas web belts, the cavalrymen retrieved the heavy metallic cartridges. They pushed the metallic rounds firmly into the open breeches and locked the steel trapdoor mechanisms shut with a sharp, definitive click. The tactile sensation of cold metal against numbed flesh grounded the men in the violent reality of the impending conflict. They adjusted their heavy gun belts, sliding the holsters forward to ensure their 6-shot revolvers were loose and ready to be drawn at a moment's notice during the chaotic close-quarters melee. The agonizing wait for the synchronized start time drained the last remaining physical reserves of the cavalrymen. Standing completely still in the sub-zero dawn caused their muscles to seize and cramp violently. Their teeth chattered uncontrollably, a sound the men desperately tried to muffle by biting down hard on the thick wool collars of their uniform shirts. The sheer terror of the impending close-quarters combat mixed directly with the agonizing physical pain of severe frostbite, creating a state of hyper-aware misery among the heavily armed ranks waiting for the violence to commence. Captain Egan surveyed the highly specific route his men had to navigate to reach the valley floor safely. The descent from the eastern ridge was incredibly steep and heavily choked with dense, interlocking plum thickets and sharp, thorny brush. The narrow, winding animal trail dropped precipitously through the heavy timber, coated entirely in a solid, unyielding sheet of smooth, blue ice. Riding a horse down this treacherous incline at any speed faster than a creeping, slow walk guaranteed a catastrophic, bone-breaking fall before the actual charge even officially began across the bottomland. Across the wide valley, Captain Moore's heavily armed dismounted battalion began their assigned flanking maneuver toward the rugged western bluffs. The men left their mounts behind with designated horse holders and started walking laboriously through waist-deep snowdrifts. The heavy, rigid leather soles of their standard-issue cavalry boots provided absolutely zero necessary traction on the steep, solidly frozen inclines. The soldiers slipped constantly, falling heavily to their hands and knees, their heavy weapon barrels digging deep into the snowpack as they clawed their way toward the necessary high ground. The tied cavalry. They tossed their heavy heads repeatedly. Their metal bridle bits clinking softly and pawed violently at the frozen earth with their sharp iron caulks. The shivering troopers had to employ direct physical force to keep the mounts quiet, wrapping their muscular arms tightly around the horses' necks and pinching their wet nostrils forcefully shut whenever the animals attempted to whinny or snort loudly into the freezing morning air and betray their hidden location on the slope. The soldiers held a distinct, highly lethal technological advantage in their hands. The single-shot, breech-loading weapons allowed for a highly rapid rate of fire, easily and quickly reloaded from a prone or fully mounted position. They also carried the heavy sidearms, providing rapid, devastating projectiles for close Combat. The sleeping warriors below possessed a highly varied arsenal, consisting of older muzzle-loading muskets, acquired repeating rifles with heavily limited ammunition, and traditional bows constructed of hickory and sinew, which required immense physical strength to draw back fully in the freezing temperatures, putting the defenders at a severe disadvantage during the initial chaotic moments. The complete lack of alarm from the sprawling village remained a stroke of immense tactical luck for the military strike force. Typically, a Native American encampment of that massive size contained hundreds of aggressive semi-feral dogs that served as a highly effective, extremely loud early warning system. However, the brutal severity of the sub-zero cold had forced the inhabitants to bring the animals deep inside the heavy buffalo hide lodges to provide additional body heat. The thick layers of snow banked heavily against the dwellings severely muffled any outside noise, keeping the canine sentries completely oblivious to the approaching army creeping down the adjacent hillsides. The highly anticipated synchronized time finally arrived. Captain Egan raised his right hand, giving the silent forward command to his tense company. The 47 heavily armed troopers urged their horses slowly toward the edge of the steep, icy trail. The descent was agonizingly slow and incredibly dangerous. The men leaned their torsos far back in their leather saddles, attempting to shift the heavy center of gravity directly over the horses' hindquarters. The animals locked their front knees rigidly, sliding downward through the thick brush, their hooves scraping loudly against the hidden rocks beneath the snow as they fought a desperate battle against raw gravity. Several large horses lost their secure footing entirely on the slick, unyielding ice, dropping heavily onto their muscular haunches and sliding entirely out of control into the dense, unforgiving plum thickets. The long, jagged wooden thorns tore ruthlessly through the soldiers' thin wool trousers, leaving deep, heavily bleeding scratches across their exposed lower legs. The panicked men fought desperately to keep the thrashing animals upright, pulling incredibly hard on the leather cheek straps and kicking their metal spurs violently into the horses' flanks to force them back onto the narrow, winding path before the formation collapsed. Captain Noy's assigned company followed directly behind Egan, mirroring the highly treacherous descent step by step. These riders rapidly uncoiled their thick braided lariats, holding the looped ropes fully ready in their right hands. They focused their attention entirely on the sprawling pony herd grazing heavily on the southern plateau. Noyes instructed his men to fan out widely the exact moment their horses hit flat ground, creating a massive, sweeping net of mounted riders designed to aggressively corral the panicked animals and push them forcefully up the eastern slope, entirely away from the impending violence of the main assault. Egan's front line finally cleared the dense, obstructive timber and reached the flat, snow-covered bottomland of the valley floor. The transition from the steep, icy trail directly to the level ground allowed the horses to fully regain their secure footing. The captain signaled his men to form a solid, unbroken line of battle, positioning the horses closely side by side, perfectly abreast. The 47 cavalrymen drew their heavy cavalry pistols, the metallic sliding of steel against leather sounding deafeningly loud in the frozen silence. They held the weapons high, the metal hammers pulled back and locked securely in the fully cocked position. Captain Egan spurred his horse forcefully forward, breaking into a rapid, high-stepping trot through the deep powder, shattering the quiet dawn and initiating the relentless slaughter. Shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning, an explosion of motion erupted across the valley floor. Captain James R. Egan spurred his mount forward, initiating the cavalry charge across the snow-covered bottomland. 47 horses lunged in unison, their hooves churning the undisturbed powder into a chaotic spray of white crystals and dark earth. The riders maintained a tight horizontal formation, driving their animals into a relentless, high-stepping gallop. The sheer physical weight of the approaching unit created a low, rhythmic rumbling that vibrated through the hardened ground. The troopers raised their .45 caliber revolvers, pointing the steel barrels toward the sleeping settlement ahead. They closed the 200-yard distance rapidly, the frigid air tearing at their exposed faces and watering their eyes. The vanguard reached the outermost dwellings of the Cheyenne encampment with devastating speed. The mounted soldiers did not alter their trajectory to navigate around the structures. Instead, they drove their cavalry steeds directly into the conical tents. The 1,200-pound animals slammed into the taut buffalo hides, transferring immense kinetic energy upon impact. Wooden lodge poles constructed from thick pine saplings snapped under the overwhelming force, emitting loud, sharp cracks resembling rifle fire. The structural framework collapsed inward, bringing hundreds of pounds of cured animal skins and packed snow crashing down upon the unsuspecting families resting inside. The sensory shock experienced by the waking inhabitants proved absolute. Oglala and Cheyenne families jolted from deep sleep to the deafening roar of trampling hooves and shattering timber. The canvas and hides pinned them against their bedding, restricting their movements and plunging them into complete darkness. Men, women, and children fought desperately to untangle themselves from the ruined dwellings, pushing against the crushing weight of the collapsed roofs. The internal fires, previously providing vital warmth, were suddenly smothered by the falling debris, sending thick clouds of choking gray smoke billowing through the ruined structures and blinding the struggling occupants. Egan's men unleashed their first volley of gunfire as they broke through the initial line of lodges. The soldiers pulled the triggers of their Colt sidearms, sending heavy lead bullets tearing through the thin leather walls of the surrounding tents. The muzzle flashes illuminated the dim morning light with brief, searing bursts of orange flame. The fired bullets penetrated the dwellings indiscriminately, striking unseen targets hidden within. The loud detonations of the handguns merged with the screams of the injured and the terrified whinnies of the horses, creating a deafening cacophony of sudden warfare. Inside one of the central Oglala structures, a projectile pierced the outer hide and struck a sleeping warrior directly in the right shoulder. The metal slug shattered the clavicle bone into jagged fragments and severed the subclavian artery. The resulting arterial pressure sprayed bright crimson blood across the interior lining of the tent. The wounded man convulsed, clutching the bleeding trauma with his left hand as his body rapidly went into hemorrhagic shock. The warm fluid pooled quickly on the packed earth floor, congealing into dark, sticky ice within seconds of exposure to the sub-zero ambient temperature entering through the torn walls. As the cavalrymen exhausted the 6 rounds in their revolvers, they swiftly holstered the handguns and unslung their Springfield carbines. Riding at a full gallop, the troopers operated the breech-loading mechanisms with practiced efficiency, despite their severely frost-bitten fingers. They flipped open the steel trap doors, extracted a fresh metallic cartridge from their canvas web belts, shoved the brass cylinder into the chamber, and locked the breech shut. The soldiers emerging into an absolute nightmare. The temperature sat at 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the fleeing people were severely underdressed. Many wore only thin cotton shirts or light sleeping skins, their bare feet stepping directly onto the sharp crust of the winter snowpack. The sudden exposure to the Arctic elements induced uncontrollable shivering and robbed them of their breath. Mothers grabbed their infants, clutching the small bodies tightly to their chests in a desperate attempt to shield them from both the flying bullets and the lethal cold. Warriors scrambled to retrieve their weapons from the debris. A Cheyenne defender pulled an older muzzle-loading musket from beneath a collapsed pile of lodge poles. He knelt in the deep snow, ignoring the wind biting at his exposed torso. He poured black powder down the iron barrel, rammed a spherical projectile home with a wooden rod, and placed a percussion cap on the nipple. The warrior raised the weapon, aimed at a passing cavalryman, and pulled the trigger. A cloud of thick white smoke erupted from the muzzle, obscuring his vision as the ball flew toward the charging line. The fired musket ball struck the flank of a passing cavalry horse, burying itself deep within the animal's muscular hind quarter. The steed shrieked in agony, its hind legs buckling under the sudden trauma. The horse pitched violently forward, throwing its rider completely out of the leather saddle. The trooper soared through the air, crashing into a frozen snowbank. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs and dislocated his left shoulder. He rolled onto his back, grasping his useless arm, watching his crippled mount thrash wildly on the ground, kicking its hooves in a desperate, futile attempt to stand back up. Simultaneous to the central village assault, Captain Henry Noyes executed his assigned maneuver on the elevated southern plateau. His company of troopers swung wide, establishing a sweeping perimeter around the grazing pony herd. The hundreds of animals, startled by the eruption of gunfire and shouting from the valley below, began to panic. The horses tossed their heads, flattened their ears, and began circling tightly against one another. The sheer volume of the distressed herd created a chaotic thunder of hooves stamping against the frozen earth. The young boys assigned to guard the animals attempted to maintain control. They waved their arms frantically and shouted commands, trying to soothe the terrified beasts. Their efforts proved entirely useless against the encroaching wall of mounted soldiers. Noyes' men spurred their horses forward, uncoiling their braided rawhide lariats. They swung the ropes in wide circles above their heads, utilizing the menacing motion and the sharp cracking sound to intimidate the lead mares. The cavalrymen drove aggressively into the flanks of the herd, actively separating the animals from their youthful handlers. The pressure from the approaching line of troops triggered a stampede. 800 horses broke their tight cluster and surged eastward, driven purely by blind animal terror. The herd crashed through the sparse timber, snapping low-hanging branches and churning the snow into a wide avenue of brown mud and slush. Noyes' company rode hard on the outside edges of the moving mass, acting as armed sheepdogs. They fired their weapons into the air to keep the animals moving rapidly away from the settlement, successfully severing the tribes from their primary source of transportation and survival. Back in the valley floor, the fleeing families faced a grueling, desperate trek. Their only viable avenue of escape lay to the west, toward the towering rocky terraces flanking the river. The panicked crowd of elders, women, and children slogged through waist-deep snowdrifts, their bare legs suffering lacerations from the hidden crusts of ice. Every step required monumental physical exertion. The frigid air burned their lungs and the extreme cold began claiming their extremities. Frostbite set in on exposed toes and fingers, the skin turning a dead, waxy white as the cellular fluid froze solid. Captain Alexander Moore's dismounted battalion opened fire from their elevated positions on the western ridges. Looking down upon the chaotic scene, the soldiers sighted their Springfield rifles on the warriors attempting to cover the retreat. The plunging fire from the high ground proved devastating. Bullets rained down from above, striking the earth and kicking up tall geysers of pulverized snow. The projectiles tore through the thin cottonwood branches, showering the fleeing families with wooden splinters and bark. The crossfire effectively pinned the defenders, preventing them from establishing a solid firing line to protect the vulnerable non-combatants. A prominent Oglala fighter, carrying a newly acquired repeating rifle, took a defensive stance behind a large, overturned drying rack. He worked the lever action swiftly, ejecting spent brass casings into the snow while firing rapidly up at the ridges. His sustained suppression allowed a large group of women and toddlers to scramble past his position toward the base of the cliffs. The warriors' defiance drew concentrated attention from the troops above. A volley of .45 caliber rounds pelted the wooden rack, splintering the structure and forcing the man to drop flat onto his stomach to avoid being completely shredded by the incoming fusillade. Egan's company continued their relentless sweep, pushing entirely through the center of the lodge cluster. They systematically dismantled the encampment, utilizing their horses to trample any structures left standing from the initial impact. The troopers ignored the discarded belongings scattered across the snow, intricately beaded clothing, dried meat stores, and winter robes. Their sole focus remained on driving the human targets out of the bottomland. The soldiers shouted hoarse commands at one another, their voices barely audible over the continuous roar of the raging gun battle and the shrieks of the displaced inhabitants. The mass exodus finally reached the base of the steep western terraces. The terrain shifted from flat snowy plains to jagged vertical rock faces covered in slick blue ice. The climbing process proved agonizingly slow and dangerous. Mothers hoisted their crying children upward, passing them to hands reaching down from higher ledges. The physical desperation pushed their exhausted bodies past all normal limits, driven entirely by the primal urge for solid cover. The defenders armed with traditional hickory bows proved remarkably effective in the close-quarters environment at the base of the bluffs. An older Cheyenne man drew back a sinew bowstring, his muscles straining against the rigid, freezing wood. He released the shaft, sending a steel-tipped arrow sailing silently through the air. The projectile struck a mounted cavalryman directly in the thigh, piercing the wool trousers and burying itself deep into the quadricep muscle. The wounded soldier cried out, dropping his carbine into the snow. The intense pain caused him to lose his grip on the reins, and his horse veered sharply away from the rock face. The trooper clutched the wooden shaft protruding from his leg, his woolen mittens preventing him from gripping it properly to attempt a removal. Blood flowed freely down his saddle, soaking the leather and freezing into solid red streaks down the horse's flank. His comrades laid down a barrage of covering fire, allowing the injured man to retreat slowly toward the relative safety of the eastern tree line. As the morning progressed, the entire population of the village evacuated the bottomland. The Oglala and Cheyenne families scrambled high into the rocky crevices, finding precarious shelter among the crags and overhangs. The warriors occupied the most advantageous ledges, establishing a formidable defensive perimeter looking down upon their ruined homes. They utilized every available piece of cover, their weapons trained steadily on the soldiers below. The element of surprise had completely evaporated, replaced by a tense, highly dangerous standoff between the occupying military force and the entrenched, desperate defenders holding the superior high ground. Captain Egan signaled his exhausted men to halt their advance at the northernmost edge of the settlement. The troopers reined in their heaving mounts, their horses' chests covered in thick white lather that was already beginning to freeze into solid sheets of ice. The cavalrymen sat in their saddles, scanning the quieted village. The sprawling encampment, previously teeming with life just an hour earlier, now resembled a shattered, smoking wasteland. Collapsed buffalo hides, splintered lodge poles, and discarded possessions littered the trampled, blood-stained snow across the entire valley floor. The primary objectives of the morning assault were technically achieved. The military strike force had captured the pony herd and evicted the hostile bands from their sheltered winter dwellings. However, the victory remained entirely incomplete and highly precarious. The soldiers now found themselves occupying the vulnerable low ground, completely exposed to the elements and the vengeful gaze of hundreds of skilled marksmen positioned in the impassable rocks above. The subzero temperature continued to plummet, transforming the harsh weather from a mere discomfort into a lethal, active participant in the unfolding battle. The troops looked down at their own hands, realizing the extreme toll the charge had taken on their bodies. The metal components of their firearms had leached the warmth directly from their flesh. Frostbite severely damaged their fingers, rendering them stiff, clumsy, and agonizingly painful. Loading the small, intricate copper cartridges into the carbine breeches became a monumental task requiring intense concentration and awkward, fumbling movements. The adrenaline rush of the initial attack began to fade rapidly, replaced by the creeping, profound lethargy induced by the deep Arctic freeze settling over the valley. Noise Company returned from their sweeping maneuver, successfully pushing the captured pony herd onto a secured plateau miles away from the main conflict zone. The successful removal of the horses guaranteed the tribes could not mount a rapid counterattack or flee the region entirely. The achievement, however, offered little comfort to the freezing men currently holding the ruined village. The commanders gathered near the center of the destroyed camp, taking cover behind a large fallen cottonwood trunk to assess their highly compromised tactical situation. The officers understood they could not hold the valley indefinitely. The extreme cold threatened to cause more casualties among the troops than the enemy bullets. Furthermore, they lacked the necessary supplies, having left their winter gear and rations behind with the pack train. The captured settlement offered abundant resources, robes, dried food, and shelter, but retrieving these items required moving through the open, exposing the soldiers to the continuous, accurate sniper fire raining down from the western bluffs. The tactical trap had essentially reversed itself. The attackers were now the besieged. The Native American families huddled, together on the icy ledges, watching the destruction of their livelihoods. The profound loss of their homes and their vast horse herd constituted a devastating, catastrophic blow to their survival. Yet the determination to fight remained unbroken. The warriors conserved their limited ammunition, waiting patiently for any cavalryman foolish enough to step away from cover. The standoff solidified, a brutal stalemate forged in blood, frozen timber, and the unforgiving icy grip of the Wyoming winter. The initial assault had concluded, giving way to a grueling test of endurance and willpower. As the morning wore on, a grim shift in tactical momentum settled across the Powder River Basin. The indigenous fighters, having successfully pushed their vulnerable families higher into the broken ground west of the village, finalized a defensive perimeter along the precipitous western terraces. These elevated limestone outcroppings provided a supreme vantage point overlooking the ruined settlement below. Hundreds of Oglala and northern Cheyenne marksmen wedged their bodies securely between giant boulders and jagged shale pillars. The combatants possessed a distinct topographical advantage, shielded from returning fire by thick stone walls, while enjoying unobstructed downward sightlines toward the occupying military forces. The gelid wind whipped across the high crags, tossing their long dark hair and tearing at their thin cotton shirts. Yet the men ignored the glacial temperatures to focus entirely on the targets milling beneath the cliffs. Chief Two Moons moved swiftly along the icy ledges, coordinating the Cheyenne defensive line. He carried a highly prized Winchester repeating rifle, its brass receiver cold against his bare skin. The seasoned leader directed his younger fighters to spread out evenly across the cliff face, preventing the soldiers from concentrating their upward volleys on a single clustered position. Beside him, He-Dog positioned the Oglala sharpshooters behind natural granite barricades. The warriors checked their varied arsenals, ensuring their weapons functioned despite the Arctic conditions. Men carrying older muzzleloaders meticulously measured black powder from hollowed horn flasks, while those possessing lever-action rifles carefully fed cartridges into the tubular magazines located beneath the steel barrels. The first coordinated barrage from the bluffs erupted with startling ferocity. A synchronized roar of hundreds of firearms echoed off the canyon walls, sending a lethal rain of projectiles tearing downward into the valley floor. Thick clouds of white gun smoke blossomed along the ridgeline, temporarily obscuring the shooters from the troops below. The discharged bullets hissed through the dense, frigid air, striking the powder-covered bottomland with terrifying kinetic impact. Geysers of white crystals and dark earth exploded upward across the entire expanse of the destroyed village. The previously victorious cavalrymen suddenly found themselves caught in a deadly, inescapable crossfire. Down in the settlement, the incoming fusillade triggered absolute chaos among the dismounted troopers. The men scrambled frantically for any available cover, diving face first into the slush. They sought refuge behind the fallen cottonwood trunks, the collapsed structural frames of the ruined lodges, and the stiffening carcasses of the horses killed during the dawn charge. The soldiers pressed their bodies flat against the ground, trying to make themselves the smallest possible targets. The constant whistling of munitions, passing mere inches above their heads, created a paralyzing psychological terror. The hunters had officially become the hunted. Trapped in a geographic bowl, he crouched behind a flimsy pile of discarded buffalo hides, reloading his Springfield carbine. A large caliber projectile fired from an elevated Henry rifle struck him squarely in the upper back. The heavy lead slug shattered his left scapula, tore through the underlying muscle tissue, and punctured his left lung before exiting his chest cavity. The soldier pitched violently forward, his face burying directly into a deep snowbank. Bright crimson arterial fluid sprayed from the exit wound, rapidly melting the precipitation beneath him before the surrounding sub-zero air congealed the blood into a solid, macabre pool. His fellow troopers could do nothing to assist the fallen man. Any attempt to leave their meager cover invited certain death from the accurate sniper fire raining down from the precipice. The injured recruit gasped for oxygen, his compromised organ failing to process the thin alpine atmosphere. Pink, frothy bubbles formed at the corners of his mouth with every labored exhalation, turning to ice against his lips and chin. His extremities twitched sporadically as profound hemorrhagic shock overwhelmed his nervous system. Within minutes, the violent shivering ceased entirely, his body surrendering to the combined lethality of severe internal trauma and profound hypothermia. Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds crouched behind the thick root system of a toppled tree, assessing the rapidly deteriorating situation. He barked orders to his subordinate officers, his voice straining to carry over the deafening roar of the continuous bombardment. Reynolds realized his men were sitting ducks in the open bottomland. He commanded Captain Alexander Moore to organize a concentrated returning fire to suppress the warriors holding the high ground. Moore relayed the instructions down the line, prompting the frightened soldiers to carefully peek over their barricades and shoulder their weapons. The troops aimed their iron sights upward, attempting to target the faint flashes flickering among the distant gray rocks. Firing upward proved highly ineffective for the pinned detachment. The steep angle of the cliff face required the soldiers to lean far back, exposing their torsos and heads to the enemy snipers. Furthermore, the intense glare of the morning sun reflecting off the pristine snowpack caused severe visual distortion. The cavalrymen suffered from partial snow blindness, their eyes watering profusely as they squinted through the brilliant, agonizing light. The thick gun smoke settling over the valley floor further obscured their vision, creating a dense, blinding fog. The soldiers fired blindly toward the ridges, lubricants applied to the internal firing mechanisms of the Springfield carbines thickened into a sticky, unyielding paste under the severe cold. When the soldiers attempted to work the breech blocks to extract spent casings, the metal components seized completely. Troopers resorted to using their heavy knives and sturdy sticks to pry the brass cylinders free, losing precious seconds and exposing themselves to the continuous incoming fire. Frustration mounted as the normally reliable firearms transformed into useless steel clubs, leaving many men completely defenseless against the withering assault. Capitalizing on the Army's mechanical failures, the Cheyenne and Oglala fighters intensified their bombardment. They focused their aim on the officers attempting to maintain order among the panicked ranks. A bullet ripped through the thick wool sleeve of Captain James R. Egan's coat, grazing his bicep and drawing a thin line of blood. The captain ignored the stinging flesh wound, continuing to shout encouragement to his pinned company. He directed his men to conserve their remaining ammunition, recognizing that blind firing into the rock served only to deplete their limited supplies. Perched upon a narrow, jutting crag, a seasoned Oglala marksman identified a cluster of soldiers hiding behind a collapsed lodge structure. He adjusted the rear sight of his captured Sharps rifle, compensating for the steep downward trajectory and the crosswinds sweeping through the canyon. The warrior steadied his breathing, aligned the front blade with the chest of a kneeling corporal, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy slug slammed into the soldier's collarbone, shattering the skeletal structure and driving sharp bone fragments deep into his neck. The corporal collapsed silently, his life ending, before his body hit the slush. Prolonged exposure to the ambush began breaking the soldiers' resolve. They were hungry and entirely trapped in a hostile environment with no hope of reinforcement. The continuous shrieking of ricocheting bullets and the agonizing cries of the wounded created an atmosphere of pure despair. Men pressed their faces into the dirt, praying for an end to the relentless barrage. Some soldiers lost their composure entirely, dropping their weapons and attempting to crawl away through the deep drifts. The non-commissioned officers physically restrained these panicked individuals, threatening them with court-martial or summary execution to prevent a mass rout. Frostbite ravaged their exposed skin, turning noses, ears, and fingertips black with necrotic tissue. The soldiers, having discarded their winter coats and blankets prior to the dawn charge, lacked any protection against the biting gale. The men lost all tactile sensation in their hands, rendering them unable to properly load their weapons or bandage their bleeding comrades. Shivering racked their frames so violently they could not hold their rifles steady, further diminishing the accuracy of their desperate return fire. Survival became a sheer test of physical endurance against the unyielding elements. High atop the terraces, the Native American fighters endured their own severe hardships. The jagged rocks provided solid cover but offered zero warmth. The warriors, many clad only in thin leggings and moccasins, stood exposed to the full force of the Arctic winds sweeping down from the mountain peaks. They stamped their feet and rubbed their arms to maintain circulation, passing the few available buffalo robes among themselves. Despite the agonizing cold, their determination never wavered. They fought to protect their territory and their way of life, fueled by a righteous anger burning hotter than the freezing air surrounding them. Near 10 o'clock in the morning, a minor tactical shift occurred along the cliff line. A group of Cheyenne fighters successfully navigated a narrow, hidden fissure along the northern rock face, flanking the military's current position. This maneuver allowed the warriors to pour enfilading fire down the length of the valley, catching the soldiers behind their established barricades. The crossfire proved devastating. Bullets struck the troops from two distinct angles, eliminating their previously secure cover. Panic surged through the ranks as men scrambled desperately to find new hiding spots, exposing themselves entirely during the frantic relocation. During this chaotic reshuffling, a private from the 2nd Cavalry received a grievous injury. As he sprinted across an open patch of ground toward a large boulder, a bullet tore through his right thigh. The projectile struck the femur, shattering the thick bone into a dozen jagged shards. The man screamed in agony, collapsing violently into the snowpack. Two courageous comrades leaped from behind their shelter to rescue the crippled soldier. They sprinted through the gauntlet of flying projectiles, grabbing the wounded man by his uniform collar and dragging him forcefully backward. The rough movement exacerbated the shattered femur, causing the private to pass out from the sheer intensity of the pain. The rescuers managed to pull him behind a fallen log, their own chests heaving from the immense exertion. They desperately tried to fashion a crude tourniquet from a torn leather strap, working with numb, uncooperative fingers to stem the massive blood loss pouring from the torn femoral artery. Recognizing the futility of their position, Colonel Reynolds reconsidered his entire operational strategy. Occupying the destroyed village served no further military purpose. The pony herd was secure, the lodges were ruined, and the inhabitants were scattered. Remaining in the valley floor meant subjecting his command to a slow, agonizing annihilation by sniper fire and exposure. The colonel realized a full withdrawal was the only logical option to save the surviving members of his detachment. He summoned his captains, organizing a phased retreat designed to pull the men safely out of the lethal kill zone. Captain Anson Mills received the dangerous task of covering the initial withdrawal. His reserve battalion, previously held back near the northern perimeter, moved aggressively forward. They formed a tight skirmish line behind a ridge of packed snow, pouring concentrated rapid fire toward the western bluffs. The sheer volume of this suppressing barrage forced the Native American snipers to temporarily duck behind their stone barricades, providing a brief, vital window of opportunity for the pinned soldiers to move. The deafening roar of the combined Springfield carbines echoed like continuous thunder through the narrow canyon. Shielded by Mills' fusillade, the wounded men were evacuated first. Soldiers hoisted their injured comrades onto their shoulders, carrying them painfully through the deep drifts toward the eastern tree line where the remaining horses were tethered. The journey proved agonizing. Every step through the knee-deep slush required immense effort, the burden of the crippled bodies pressing heavily on the exhausted rescuers. The frigid air burned their lungs, and their frozen boots slipped constantly on the slick, uneven terrain. Blood dripped steadily from the injured men, leaving a distinct bright red trail across the pristine white snowscape. Spotting the withdrawal, the indigenous fighters quickly recognized the army's attempt to disengage. They leaned out from behind their granite shields, ignoring the incoming suppression, and resumed their accurate bombardment. They targeted the slow-moving pairs of soldiers carrying the wounded, recognizing them as the most vulnerable targets. The snipers adjusted their sights, calculating the distance and wind speed with practiced ease, determined to inflict maximum casualties before the invaders could reach the safety of the dense forest. A precise shot from a Cheyenne marksman sent a bullet tearing through the calf of a rescuing private. The man stumbled, dropping his injured comrade heavily into the snow. The two men lay tangled together, completely exposed, until another squad rushed forward to drag them both into the safety of the thick timber. The incident highlighted the extreme peril of the retreat, proving that every inch of ground gained toward the forest required a toll paid in blood and immense physical suffering. Once the injured reached the trees, Captain Moore's battalion began their calculated backward march. They moved in alternating bounds, half the men running backward while the other half provided covering fire. The tactical maneuver required flawless coordination and immense discipline, qualities severely eroded by the profound physical misery plaguing the troops. Men slipped on hidden ice patches, their weapons firing wildly into the sky. The continuous terrifying sound of bullets snapping past their ears fueled a desperate urge to simply turn and run blindly toward safety, a chaotic impulse the officers violently suppressed. Refusing to relent, the warriors on the bluffs pressed their advantage, moving lower down the rocky terraces to maintain visual contact with the retreating army. They bounded from boulder to boulder, their agility completely unaffected by the treacherous conditions. The fighters utilized the natural contours of the cliff face, appearing suddenly to unleash a volley before vanishing back into the shadows. Their relentless pursuit ensured the cavalrymen found no respite during their backward march. Bullets shattered tree branches and thudded into thick pine trunks, showering the exhausted troops with wood splinters and bark. The men dove past the tree line, scrambling on their hands and knees to put as much solid wood between themselves and the snipers as physically possible. Breaching the forest canopy provided psychological relief but little physical sanctuary. The trees offered marginal protection from the sniper fire, yet the glacial temperatures persisted. The men collapsed against the frozen trunks, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling uncontrollably from the combined effects of adrenaline depletion and severe hypothermia. They checked their remaining ammunition, discovering their canvas belts were nearly empty. The massive expenditure of rounds during the morning assault and the subsequent defensive stand had severely depleted their limited resources. The detachment stood dangerously close to becoming completely defenseless in the heart of hostile territory. Medical care among the trees grew increasingly dire. Without the heavy supply train, the troops lacked adequate bandages, surgical instruments, and medicinal alcohol. The hospital stewards tore extra wool shirts into crude strips, wrapping the bleeding traumas tightly to prevent further fluid loss. The extreme cold served as a brutal double-edged sword. The subzero air naturally restricted the blood flow, slowing the hemorrhaging, but simultaneously accelerated the onset of necrotic frostbite around the open injuries. The wounded men whimpered in agony, their cries muffled by the thick woolen scarves wrapped tightly around their freezing faces. Assessing the surviving members of his command, Colonel Reynolds realized the gravity of their situation. The initial victorious charge had devolved into a desperate fight for pure survival. The physical toll was staggering. Several men lay dead in the valley, their bodies unrecoverable under the intense enemy crossfire. Dozens more suffered from severe gunshot wounds, shattered bones, and debilitating frostbite. The captured pony herd represented a significant strategic victory, but the tactical situation remained incredibly precarious. The detachment was exhausted, starving, freezing, and nearly out of ammunition, facing a highly motivated, entrenched enemy possessing the superior high ground. Watching from their dominant positions along the western ridges, Chief Two Moons and He Dog gathered their sub-chiefs, analyzing the shifting dynamics of the battlefield. The warriors had successfully defended their families and inflicted severe damage upon the invading force. However, they understood the soldiers still possessed lethal firepower and held the vital horse herd captive. The tribal leaders decided to hold their elevated perimeter, refusing to abandon the high ground and risk a direct confrontation in the dense, snowy forest. As midday arrived, the standoff settled into a grim stalemate. The continuous roar of gunfire dwindled to sporadic, isolated sniper shots echoing hollowly through the canyon. The silence between the gunshots felt heavier and more oppressive than the noise of the battle itself. Both sides sat entrenched in their respective frozen positions, watching each other warily across the ruined expanse of the destroyed village. The temperature hovered near 30 degrees below zero. A relentless, invisible enemy actively draining the life force from every man present in the Powder River Basin. By late morning, a brutal mandate went out. Colonel Reynolds stood among the shivering pines, surveying his pinned cavalrymen. The strategic goal of the expedition remained unfinished despite the successful capture of the pony herd. To permanently break the resistance of the Oglala and Cheyenne, their physical means of survival had to be entirely eradicated. Reynolds issued a grim directive to his subordinate officers. A designated contingent of enlisted men needed to leave the protective timber, advance back into the contested bottomland, and systematically incinerate the sprawling encampment. The order demanded immense courage. The valley floor was a known kill zone, pre-sighted by hundreds of indigenous snipers positioned on the western terraces. Captain James R. Egan tasked a squad of volunteers to execute the perilous arson mission. These selected troopers handed their carbines to their comrades, opting to carry only their weighty Colt revolvers and sharp belt knives. They required their hands free to manipulate the cumbersome buffalo hides and ignite the structural debris. The chosen privates stepped to the edge of the forest, staring out at the blood-stained expanse. A coordinating volley from the tree line provided minimal covering suppression. The designated arson squad broke from the timber, sprinting through the deep, churning slush. They ran in unpredictable zigzag patterns, their leather boots slipping on hidden patches of slick ice. High above, the tribal marksmen reacted swiftly to the abrupt movement. Lever-action rifles and muzzle loaders cracked from the elevated granite barricades, sending lethal projectiles snapping through the gelid air. The running runners heard the terrifying hiss of the passing munitions cutting mere inches past their ears. Reaching the first cluster of collapsed dwellings, the attackers threw themselves against the packed drifts for temporary cover. The conical tents lay in ruined heaps, the stout pine saplings fractured by the early cavalry charge. The men drew their steel knives, gripping the bone handles with numb, frost-bitten fingers. They slashed violently at the cured leather, cutting wide gashes through the layers to expose the flammable interiors. The dense skins proved incredibly resilient, blunting the sharp edges and demanding severe physical exertion to penetrate the tough hides. Igniting the structures in 30 degrees below zero weather presented a formidable logistical challenge. The men scavenged through the wreckage, searching for the remnants of the morning cooking hearths. They dug through the collapsed debris, finding small, glowing embers buried beneath layers of ash and packed earth. Using dry prairie grass pulled from the undersides of the drifts, the soldiers carefully coaxed the coals back to life. They cupped their hands around the fragile sparks, shielding the tiny embers from the relentless, biting northern gale. Once the tinder caught, the men fed splintered wood and dry cottonwood bark into the growing blaze. They shoved the burning bundles deep inside the slashed buffalo hides. The processed leather resisted combustion initially, producing an acrid smog that smelled of singed hair and rendering fat. Slowly, the intense thermal energy overcame the bitter ambient temperature. The flames licked upward, catching the dry wooden framework and transforming the ruined tent into a roaring bonfire. The inferno cast a harsh, flickering orange glow against the pristine white snowpack. The squads moved methodically down the length of the settlement, repeating the dangerous process. They operated in pairs, one man manipulating the heat source while his partner kept a vigilant watch on the western bluffs with a drawn sidearm. The snipers above intensified their barrage, utilizing the growing columns of dark exhaust as visual markers to target the arsonists. The Cheyenne and Oglala protectors understood the dire implications of the Army's actions. Without their shelters, the alpine climate would inevitably claim the lives of their displaced families. A bullet from a large-caliber Sharps rifle slammed into the ground beside a kneeling private, kicking a shower of frosty dirt into his face. The soldier flinched, dropping his burning bundle of grass, but recovered his composure. He scrambled to a neighboring lodge, dragging a canvas sack filled with dry sagebrush. He dumped the contents onto a smoldering coal bed, watching the brush ignite with a rapid whoosh. The heat radiated outward, momentarily thawing the ice crusted onto his wool uniform before the chilling wind ripped the warmth away. The destruction extended far beyond the physical dwellings. The troopers received explicit instructions to eradicate the tribe's entire winter food supply. Inside the collapsed tents, the enlisted men discovered vast caches of provisions carefully prepared during the autumn hunt. They found hundreds of tightly sewn animal bladders filled with pemmican, a high-calorie mixture of pulverized bison meat, rendered tallow, and dried chokecherries. This compact food source represented months of arduous labor and was absolutely essential for enduring the barren months on the high plains. The starving cavalrymen, operating on empty stomachs since the previous day, stared at the abundant stores with profound physical craving. Their abdominal muscles cramped violently at the rich scent of the cured meat. Yet military discipline prevailed over basic human hunger. The soldiers used their knives to slice open the leather bladders, dumping the precious pemmican directly onto the growing fires. The fat acted as a powerful accelerant, causing the flames to surge upward with intense ferocity, producing a crackling roar that echoed off the canyon walls. Giant woven baskets containing dried venison and elk flanks met the same fate. The privates hurled the ponderous containers into the center of the infernos. The lean strips of meat curled and blackened in the extreme heat, turning rapidly to useless ash. The pungent aroma of roasting flesh filled the valley, a cruel irony for the famished orchestrators directing the destruction. By annihilating the food stores, the army ensured the fleeing families would face starvation even if they managed to escape the lethal sub-zero exposure. Next, the arson squads targeted the extensive stockpiles of clothing and survival gear. The indigenous women had spent countless hours tanning hides, transforming them into robes capable of warding off the Arctic drafts. The soldiers dragged these colossal, meticulously prepared, fur-lined pelts from the wreckage, forcefully piling them high upon the fiercely burning lodge frames. The dense fur caught fire slowly, smoldering and producing voluminous clouds of greasy black soot that rolled heavily across the bottomland, choking the troops and burning their watering eyes. Intricately decorated garments adorned with colored glass beads and dyed porcupine quills were ruthlessly tossed into the conflagration. Beautifully crafted buckskin war shirts, sturdy winter moccasins lined with soft rabbit fur, and intricately fringed leggings succumbed rapidly to the intense combustion. The delicate beadwork popped and shattered as the underlying leather shriveled and charred. These items represented not only vital insulation against the lethal elements, but also the rich cultural heritage and personal identities of the displaced Oglala and Cheyenne people. The attackers discovered and destroyed a vast array of specialized equipment essential for nomadic life. They shattered wooden saddle frames meticulously carved from sturdy cottonwood and bound with wet rawhide. They tossed woven lariats and riding tack into the blazes. Without this vital equestrian gear, the tribes could not effectively utilize any horses they might manage to recapture in the future. The systematic sabotage stripped the indigenous fighters of their logistical capabilities, reducing them to desperate foot wanderers in a frozen wasteland. The spreading conflagration created a surreal, hellish environment within the Powder River Basin. Over 100 separate fires raged simultaneously across the valley floor. The intense thermal energy generated by the burning village created localized updrafts, pulling the freezing air inward and whipping the flames into towering, twisting vortexes. The contrasting temperatures caused the surrounding snow to melt rapidly, transforming the ground into a treacherous, boiling swamp of hot mud and ash, even as the ambient atmosphere remained firmly trapped at 30 degrees below zero. The blanket of billowing smog proved both a blessing and a curse for the arson squads. The thick clouds provided vital visual concealment, obscuring the soldiers' movements from the keen eyes of the snipers positioned on the high terraces. The marksmen could no longer draw accurate beads on the running men, forcing them to fire blindly into the haze. However, the toxic fumes severely irritated the troopers' respiratory systems. The men gagged constantly, covering their mouths with their woolen sleeves as their lungs burned from inhaling the noxious exhaust. Navigating the burning labyrinth required extreme caution. The soldiers had to avoid the collapsing structures as blazing lodge poles fell randomly from the sky, threatening to crush or severely burn anyone standing too close. A corporal from the 2nd Cavalry narrowly avoided catastrophe when a flaming support beam crashed into the slush mere inches from his boots. The impact splashed boiling water and embers across his canvas trousers, forcing him to roll frantically in a nearby snowbank to extinguish the smoldering fabric before it seared his flesh. Despite the visual cover, the tribal snipers continued their relentless bombardment, utilizing the sound of snapping timber and shouting voices to guide their shots. A Winchester slug found its mark, striking a young private in the right forearm as he hurled a buffalo robe onto a fire. The copper projectile shattered his radius bone, causing him to drop the pelt into the mud. He clutched his bleeding limb, crying out in pain as his squad mates rushed forward to pull him behind a smoking pile of debris for rudimentary first aid. The fighters on the bluffs watched the systematic obliteration of their entire worldly possessions with profound, stoic rage. They saw the towering flames completely consume their carefully constructed homes, their vital winter rations, and their highly specialized protective clothing. The psychological impact of this total devastation was catastrophic. The military had successfully weaponized the brutal Wyoming climate directly against the inhabitants. Without adequate shelter or calorie-dense food, the survival of their elders, women, and small children hiding in the freezing alpine crevices became highly precarious, bordering on the impossible. Driven by a desperate need to counter the rampant destruction, several seasoned Cheyenne combatants attempted a highly dangerous, daring raid down from the northern cliff face. They scrambled down the icy rocks, hoping to retrieve a cache of repeating rifles hidden beneath a specific lodge before the flames reached it. The descending braves moved with incredible agility, their moccasins gripping the slick stone. They sprinted into the smoke-filled valley, their weapons raised, prepared to engage the arson squads in close-quarters combat to secure their hidden arsenal. A watchful cavalry sergeant spotted the encroaching attackers through a brief break in the rolling smog. He shouted a frantic warning to his unit, raising his heavy Colt revolver and firing 2 quick shots toward the running figures. The sudden gunfire alerted the rest of the troops, who promptly abandoned their burning tasks and drew their own sidearms. A chaotic, point-blank skirmish erupted instantly among the blazing ruins. The soldiers and warriors exchanged rapid fire, the bright muzzle flashes illuminating the dense haze with blinding strobe-like intensity across the ruined camp. A lunging Cheyenne combatant swung a war club crafted from a solid stone head and a flexible wooden handle. The weapon struck a trooper squarely in the ribs, producing a sickening crack of fractured bone. The cavalryman fell backward into a puddle of hot slush, gasping for air. Before the warrior could deliver a fatal downward strike, another enlisted man stepped sideways and fired his revolver directly into the fighter's chest. The slug dropped the man instantly, his body collapsing beside the burning remnants of a collapsed lodge. The violent clash concluded as the remaining indigenous fighters realized the overwhelming numerical superiority of the dismounted defenders converging on their position. Outgunned in the open, the braves retreated swiftly back toward the rocky terraces, utilizing the dense smoke to mask their escape. They failed to retrieve the hidden cache of rifles, abandoning the weapons to the advancing flames. The soldiers did not pursue the retreating men, choosing instead to consolidate their defensive line and tend to their newly wounded comrades suffering from the crushed ribcage. With the skirmish resolved, the arson squads redoubled their destructive efforts. They moved to the final northernmost cluster of dwellings, ensuring no structure remained intact. They smashed cast-iron cooking pots, rendering them useless for boiling snow or rendering fat. They broke the wooden shafts of ceremonial lances and destroyed highly prized sleds designed for transporting the young and elderly across the plains. Every item holding practical value or cultural importance was systematically broken, burned, or scattered into the churning mud by the relentless cavalrymen. The intense heat from the fires eventually triggered a secondary hazard. Several of the lodges contained personal reserves of black powder stored in hollowed-out horns or leather pouches. As the flames consumed these hidden caches, the volatile powder ignited, causing sudden explosions that sent rocketing debris flying through the air. The soldiers learned to give the roaring bonfires a wide berth, dodging the unpredictable shrapnel of shattered lodge poles and burning buffalo hide raining down around them as the munitions cooked off in the intense thermal pockets. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the systematic eradication of the indigenous village was finally complete. The massive encampment, once a bustling sanctuary for over 1,000 people, had been entirely reduced to a smoldering, blackened scar upon the pristine winter landscape. Over 100 large dwellings, tons of dried food, and countless pieces of invaluable survival gear had been converted to useless ash. The valley floor resembled a post-apocalyptic wasteland, littered with the charred carcasses of horses and the glowing remnants of shattered homes. Colonel Reynolds blew 3 short blasts on his silver whistle, signaling the recall. The exhausted squads began their slow, cautious withdrawal back toward the eastern tree line. Their faces were coated in a layer of greasy black soot, making their pale eyes stand out starkly against the grime. Their uniforms were singed, wet with melted slush, and stained with the blood of their injured comrades. They moved with heavy, dragging steps, their energy reserves completely depleted by the monumental physical exertion and the adrenaline crash following the close-quarters skirmish. Recognizing the Army's destructive mission was finished, the tribal snipers unleashed a final furious volley from the high terraces. The bullets snapped through the smoke, a parting expression of pure hostility. The retreating columns kept their heads down, ignoring the incoming fire, relying on the suppressing barrage provided by their fellow troopers waiting in the timber. They scrambled past the final stretch of open ground, diving gratefully behind the thick pine trunks and collapsing into the snow to rest their trembling muscles after the grueling ordeal. The completion of the destruction phase marked a grim milestone in the Powder River expedition. The military strike force had achieved its primary tactical directives, capturing the pony herd and annihilating the winter camp. However, the cost proved exceedingly high. The battered detachment was freezing, exhausted, and critically low on ammunition, surrounded by an enraged enemy holding superior, impassable terrain. The soldiers had inflicted a catastrophic blow against the Oglala and Cheyenne, but they were now stranded deep in hostile territory, facing the daunting prospect of a highly dangerous retreat. The watching warriors on the bluffs looked down upon the ashes of their livelihoods. The physical loss was absolute, setting the stage for months of extreme suffering and starvation for their displaced families. Yet, the brutal military tactic failed to break their fighting spirit. Instead, the destruction of their homes forged an unyielding, bitter resolve among the fighters. The attack solidified their hatred for the encroaching army, pushing the previously independent bands toward a much larger unified alliance with Sitting Bull's forces gathering further north, ensuring the conflict on the high plains would only escalate in the bloody months to come. 2:30 in the afternoon on March 17, 1876. The directive to withdraw circulated slowly through the shivering ranks hiding among the eastern timber. Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds realized holding the smoldering basin offered zero tactical advantage while guaranteeing mass casualties from severe environmental exposure. The ambient temperature remained 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, sapping the final reserves of human endurance from his battered detachment. The decision to abandon the contested bottomland stemmed from pure survival necessity. Remaining inside the canyon meant subjecting the surviving cavalrymen to continuous sniper fire from the bluffs, compounding the misery of the Arctic conditions. Reynolds directed his battalion commanders to prepare the remaining forces for a rapid departure. The primary objective shifted entirely from offensive combat to sheer preservation of life. The column needed to march south toward a prearranged rendezvous point situated at Lodge Pole Creek, where they expected to rejoin General George Crook and the vital supply train. Reaching that base camp meant securing food rations, warm blankets, and proper medical care for the injured troopers currently bleeding into the snowpack. The officers navigated the trees, bellowing hoarse instructions to subordinates whose minds were sluggish from the deep chill. The logistics of moving hundreds of depleted individuals and captured horses presented a daunting obstacle. Captain Anson Mills attempted to organize his reserve unit into a protective rear guard. The troops, however, were physically broken. Frostbite ravaged their extremities, rendering hands clumsy and feet completely numb inside their rigid leather boots. Simple tasks like adjusting saddle girths or checking bridle bits required agonizing effort. The enlisted fumbled with the stiff straps, their joints aching with every forced movement as they prepared to leave the sanctuary of the forest canopy. The tethered cavalry mounts suffered equally under the punishing weather. Left tied in the shadowed pines during the hours-long firefight, the animals stood stiff and uncooperative. Thick icicles hung from their muzzles, formed by their own condensed breath. When the riders tried to guide the steeds forward, the horses balked, their stiffened legs protesting every step through the deep drifts. The beasts possessed no remaining energy, their caloric reserves emptied by the grueling night march and the total lack of provided forage since the previous day. Mounting the reluctant steeds turned into a chaotic struggle. Soldiers lacking the strength to pull themselves up required physical assistance from their comrades. Men hoisted each other over the rigid saddles, groaning in pain as strained muscles tore further under the heavy exertion. The once proud, highly disciplined strike force now resembled a disorganized mob desperate to escape the valley of death. Instead of moving in a cohesive line, individual companies broke away from the timber prematurely. The overriding instinct to flee the incoming projectiles superseded strict operational protocol. Sergeants shouted commands trying to slow the pace and establish a solid defensive perimeter for the retreat. But the panicked troops ignored the directives. They spurred their mounts toward the southern exit of the canyon, leaving large gaps in the marching order that exposed the outbound column to severe danger from the cliffs. Breaking cover triggered a renewed barrage from the western terraces. The Cheyenne and Oglala marksmen recognized the retreat and sought to inflict maximum punishment on the departing invaders. Projectiles snapped through the pine branches, striking the packed slush around the horse hooves. The fleeing soldiers hunched low over the necks of their mounts, praying to avoid the deadly crossfire. The sharp cracks of the lever-action rifles echoed loudly, chasing the cavalrymen as they pushed their fatigued animals across the open expanses toward the ascending trail leading out of the basin. The steep ascent out of the Powder River terrain proved treacherous. The path leading south consisted of rugged, uneven ground choked with waist-deep powder. The vanguard horses plunged their chests into the white mounds, carving a narrow trench for the rest of the column to follow. This slow pace frustrated the troopers trapped in the rear, extending their exposure to the tribal shooters. The climbing animals slipped constantly, their iron shoes failing to find secure traction on the hidden rocks buried beneath the shifting layers of precipitation. This chaotic departure birthed a profound military tragedy. In the frantic rush to leave the kill zone, the traditional code of cavalry honor shattered completely. Several lifeless bodies of enlisted men killed during the morning engagement were left lying in the bloody mud, abandoned to the enemy. Leaving fallen comrades behind violated core Army principles, yet the overwhelming drive to escape the glacial slaughterhouse superseded all ingrained doctrines and standard operating procedures. Abandoning the dead broke a fundamental promise among the ranks, but a far darker horror unfolded. Private Lorenzo Ayers, severely wounded in the right leg and unable to walk, lay propped against a hardened cottonwood stump near the edge of the destroyed camp. He watched his company mount up and ride toward the canyon exit, anticipating a rescue detail that never materialized. The shattered bone in his thigh prevented him from crawling, leaving him entirely dependent on his fellow soldiers for salvation from the encroaching indigenous fighters. A passing trooper noticed the crippled private and shouted a frantic warning to a nearby lieutenant. The officer, overwhelmed by the chaos and the incoming volley, incorrectly assumed Ayers was already deceased. He commanded the column to keep moving, prioritizing the lives of the capable riders over a perceived corpse. The withdrawing soldiers spurred their horses past the stump, looking straight ahead to avoid the grim reality. They left their living comrade behind, sitting alone in the slush, clutching his useless limb as the army rode away. Ayres realized the horrific truth as the last cavalryman vanished into the timber. He possessed a single revolver with a few remaining cartridges in the cylinder. He dragged his heavy torso across the slush, trying desperately to follow the churned trail left by the departing regiment. The deep isolation of the burning valley swallowed him. His ultimate fate remained a dark stain on the expedition's legacy, a terrifying testament to the complete breakdown of command and moral duty during the panicked withdrawal from the battlefield. Another enlisted man also fell behind during the disorganized scramble. Struck in the torso by a glancing projectile, he stumbled into a deep ravine to avoid the relentless sniper fire. The fleeing companies failed to notice his absence during the hasty headcounts. The stranded man huddled in the frigid crevice, pressing his gloved hands against his bleeding side as the sound of his regiment faded into the howling wind. He sat trapped in the rocky fissure, entirely cut off from the retreating column and at the mercy of the elements. Knowledge of the abandoned injured men devastated the morale of the surviving troops. Rumors of the left-behind soldiers rippled through the marching line, generating intense anger and profound guilt. The ranks glared at their commanding officers, the bonds of trust dissolving rapidly in the bitter chill. The pristine discipline that defined the frontier army eroded, replaced by a cynical, desperate drive to simply survive the day. The veterans understood that a leader willing to leave a wounded man behind could not be trusted to ensure their safe return. Pushing southward, the outbound column ascended onto a wide, barren plateau swept by violent gales. The sparse timber gave way to open, featureless plains completely devoid of natural windbreaks. The Arctic wind hit the troops with renewed ferocity, unimpeded by any terrain. The temperature dropped even further as the afternoon waned, the pale sun offering zero warmth while casting long, distorted shadows across the endless white expanse. The cavalrymen pulled their collars high, bracing themselves against the continuous, invisible physical assault of the northern storm. Captain Henry Noyes drove the captured pony herd ahead of the main body. The 800 indigenous horses, resilient and accustomed to the harsh climate, moved easily through the drifts. The cavalrymen assigned to herd the animals struggled to keep pace. Their grain-fed military mounts, drained by the grueling night march and the morning battle, faltered constantly under the heavy saddles. The disparity in stamina between the wild ponies and the domesticated cavalry steeds became glaringly obvious as the miles stretched on across the high desert. Several army horses collapsed entirely on the trail. The massive beasts simply stopped walking, their knees buckling as severe caloric depletion and hypothermia claimed their remaining strength. The riders dismounted, attempting to pull the animals upright by the bridles, but the steeds refused to move. The troopers were forced to cut the girths, shoulder their heavy leather saddlebags, and continue the march on foot. The stiff carcasses of the fallen mounts marked the path of the surviving army, dark monuments against the pristine white. Walking proved infinitely more difficult than riding. The dismounted soldiers sank to their thighs in the uncompacted precipitation. Their thick footwear, designed specifically for sitting in stirrups, collected heavy clumps of ice around the soles, turning each step into a grueling feat of strength. The infantrymen gasped for air, their lungs burning, their sweat freezing against their skin the moment they paused to rest. The physical toll of slogging through the deep drifts drained the last remaining drops of their energy reserves. The medical stewards faced an impossible task. They strapped the rescued wounded across the backs of the strongest remaining horses, tying their waists to the saddles to prevent them from falling. The injured men suffered terribly during the rough journey. Every jolt sent waves of agony through shattered bones and torn flesh. The crude woolen bandages froze solid, pulling painfully at the raw edges of their injuries. The stewards walked beside the mounts, offering useless words of comfort to men screaming in genuine, unadulterated physical torment. As evening approached, the sky turned a menacing shade of bruised purple. The wind escalated into a blinding blizzard, driving sharp ice crystals horizontally across the plateau. Visibility shrank to a few dozen feet. The column tightened, the riders following the dark shapes of the horses directly in front of them to avoid wandering off the trail and disappearing into the lethal white void. The roar of the storm drowned out all other sounds, isolating each soldier within his own bubble of freezing misery. Colonel Reynolds navigated by compass and the fading tracks left by the advance scouts. The destination, Lodge Pole Creek, lay somewhere ahead in the gathering gloom. The troops pushed their bodies beyond all known limits, driven by the hope of rejoining the main column at the rendezvous point. The anticipation of relief served as the sole remaining fuel for the battered detachment. The mental image of a warm tent and boiling coffee kept their legs moving when their muscles screamed for them to simply lay down and die. After hours of torturous travel, the vanguard reached the designated valley. The scouts peered through the driving flurry, searching for the familiar outline of the pack train and the canvas structures of the infantry reserve. They expected to see the welcoming glow of dozens of sagebrush fires illuminating the canyon floor. Instead, they found an empty, desolate landscape utterly devoid of human presence. The solid creek bed lay completely undisturbed, covered in a smooth layer of fresh white powder showing no signs of recent encampment. General Crook and the supply train were missing. The realization struck the freezing cavalrymen like a physical blow to the stomach. The promised sanctuary did not exist. The prearranged coordinates contained only bare cottonwood trees and howling wind. The communication breakdown during the separation of forces days earlier had resulted in a catastrophic navigational error. A wave of profound despair washed over the strike force, entirely stranded in the wilderness. The rendezvous point was a barren failure, transforming their grueling march into a journey toward absolute, uncompromising nothingness. A wave of profound despair washed over the exhausted troops. The troopers slumped in their saddles, some openly weeping as the final shred of hope evaporated into the frigid air. They possessed no winter coats, no blankets, and absolutely no food. The hardtack rations consumed 24 hours prior were long gone. The soldiers faced another night exposed to the lethal elements, this time without the adrenaline of impending combat to sustain them. The psychological devastation of finding the valley empty broke the spirit of the entire regiment. Reynolds ordered the column to halt in a shallow depression near the iced water source. The commanders forced the despondent troops to dismount and clear the drifts for a crude bivouac. The men moved with sluggish, zombie-like motions, their cognitive functions severely impaired by the deep freeze. Survival required constant motion, yet their bodies demanded rest. The officers had to physically pull subordinates to their feet, striking them across the face to prevent them from slipping into the fatal lethargy of extreme hypothermia. The leaders understood that falling asleep equated to dying. They organized the enlisted privates into small clusters, commanding them to pace in tight circles. Soldiers slapped each other's backs and kicked at numb legs to keep the blood flowing. The severe temperature cracked the skin on their cheeks and knuckles, leaving deep fissures that bled sluggishly, the crimson fluid freezing before it could drip onto the ground. The camp transformed into a bizarre, silent dance of shivering men trying desperately to generate internal heat. Gathering fuel became a frantic priority. The troops hacked at ice-coated willow bushes with their dull blades, tearing the brittle branches free with bleeding hands. The green wood resisted ignition, requiring precious matches and shredded uniform cloth to finally catch a spark. The resulting fires were small, smoky, and provided negligible warmth, yet the shivering privates huddled around them like starving animals. They thrust their blackened fingers close to the weak flames, ignoring the searing pain as the frozen tissue rapidly thawed and began to blister. The captured pony herd, the sole prize of the costly expedition, required securing for the night. The exhausted handlers drove the massive group of horses into a narrow draw, attempting to block the exit with a line of picketed cavalry mounts. The indigenous animals, sensing the weakness of their captors and the familiar scent of the raging storm, grew restless and agitated, circling continuously in the dark. The guards stamped their boots, struggling to keep their eyes open while maintaining watch over the highly volatile, unpredictable herd. The wounded troopers endured unimaginable torment. Placed near the meager flames, they lacked proper shelter or medicinal alcohol. The dropping temperatures caused their injured limbs to ache with a deep, throbbing intensity. The medical stewards could offer nothing but empty assurances, watching helplessly as severe frostbite blackened the edges of the gunshot wounds, further destroying the damaged tissue. The victims bit down on leather straps to muffle their screams, the agony of their shattered bones amplified 1,000-fold by the merciless Arctic chill seeping into their very marrow. Midnight settled over Lodgepole Creek, plunging the battered detachment into their darkest hour. The triumphant morning charge felt like a distant, fading dream, replaced by the crushing reality of their current nightmare. Stranded, starving, and shivering, the soldiers fought a silent, desperate battle against the relentless Wyoming winter. The catastrophic errors of the hasty departure cementing their profound misery. The survival of the remaining force now depended entirely on enduring the longest, coldest night of their lives, without surrendering to the welcoming embrace of the hardened earth. 1 o'clock in the morning on March 18, 1876. The fierce squall battering Lodgepole Creek intensified, transforming the dark basin into a swirling vortex of blinding white precipitation. The depleted cavalrymen huddled within their inadequate bivouac, their bodies trembling under the continuous assault of the Arctic gale. The wind screamed through the barren cottonwood branches, carrying sharp ice crystals that scoured exposed skin like coarse sand. Visibility dropped to a mere arm's length, isolating every trooper within his own private sphere of torment. The drastic drop in temperature solidified the wet slush on their uniforms into rigid armor, locking their joints and draining their final reserves of metabolic warmth. Inside a narrow, steep-sided draw adjacent to the main camp, the captured pony collection stood clustered tightly together for mutual preservation. Nearly 800 plains horses packed the confined space, their heads lowered against the biting gusts. The sheer bulk of equine bodies generated a faint pocket of thermal energy, melting the drifts beneath their hooves into a thick, muddy slurry. The animals shifted constantly, the outer ring pressing inward to escape the punishing chill, causing a low, continuous rumble of hooves sliding against the hardened earth. A sparse detail of fatigued enlisted sentries stood watch over the entrance to the enclosure. These guards possessed nothing left to give physically or mentally. Starvation gnawed at their empty stomachs, while the overwhelming lack of sleep clouded their cognitive functions. They leaned heavily against the trunks of dead trees, utilizing the wood for structural support as their leg muscles threatened to give out completely. Their hands, encased in thick woolen mittens, rested numbly upon the receivers of their Springfield carbines, the metal surfaces coated in a thick layer of white rime. Unbeknownst to the suffering soldiers, a highly determined contingent of Oglala and northern Cheyenne fighters had tracked the retreating column throughout the grueling afternoon and evening. Surviving the destruction of their homes, these combatants refused to relinquish their most valuable asset. They followed the churn trail left by the army, pushing their own bodies through the ferocious blizzard with single-minded focus. The native trackers possessed an unmatched resilience, navigating the treacherous terrain by instinct and an intimate understanding of the regional topography, silently closing the distance between themselves and the stolen wealth. The encroaching fighters utilized the harsh weather to their absolute advantage. They wrapped their torsos in salvaged scraps of hide and woolen trade blankets, minimizing their profiles against the driving flurries. The howling storm effectively masked the crunching sound of their moccasins stepping through the crust of the drifts. They communicated purely through subtle hand gestures, coordinating a stealthy encirclement of the bivouac without uttering a single vocalization. The darkness and the dense precipitation formed a perfect, impenetrable cloak for their impending infiltration operation. The sentries guarding the entrance struggled desperately to maintain vigilance. The relentless glare of the blowing ice caused their eyes to water profusely, the tears freezing upon their lashes and blurring their vision. The roaring gale drowned out all ambient noise, effectively neutralizing their auditory perception. A guard could not hear his companion standing mere feet away, let alone the soft, calculated footsteps of hostile combatants creeping closer through the surrounding timber. The privates were essentially blind and deaf, relying entirely on luck to detect any incoming threat. A young corporal assigned to the picket line experienced the terrifying onset of deep lethargy. His chin dropped repeatedly toward his chest, his brain demanding the sweet relief of unconsciousness. He forced his eyelids open, slapping his own frozen cheeks to jolt his failing nervous system back to reality. The intense pain served as a temporary anchor, but the overwhelming urge to sleep constantly pulled him back toward the abyss. He stamped his rigid boots against the ground, trying to force circulation into his toes, entirely unaware of the dark shadows slipping past the edge of his peripheral vision. Utilizing the impairment of the army guards, the Cheyenne infiltrators breached the outer perimeter of the camp. They moved with ghost-like fluidity, crawling on their bellies through the deepest snowbanks to avoid casting silhouettes against the weak glow of the distant sagebrush fires. The braves navigated the treacherous slope leading down into the ravine, their movements synchronized with the violent gusts of wind to hide any accidental rustling of brush. They operated with supreme confidence, driven by the absolute necessity of reclaiming their mounts to ensure their families' survival. Reaching the dense mass of the confined equines, the tribal fighters employed extensive equestrian expertise. They approached the animals from the downwind side, preventing the steeds from catching the unfamiliar scent of the invaders. The warriors emitted low, soothing vocalizations, sounds the ponies recognized from birth. The agitated drove calmed instantly, their ears swiveling forward to register the familiar voices of their true handlers. The intruders moved fluidly among the tightly packed bodies, sliding their hands along the coarse winter coats to reassure the nervous beasts. The infiltrators quickly located the dominant mares situated near the center of the herd. These specific animals controlled the movement of the entire group. The fighters slipped custom-braided rawhide bridles over the mares' heads, securing the bits with practiced rapid motions. They utilized sharp flint knives to silently sever the thick hemp ropes the cavalrymen had strung across the mouth of the draw to act as a rudimentary corral. The barrier fell into the slush without a sound, opening a clear, unobstructed path toward the northern plains. One of the shivering cavalry sentries finally noticed a subtle anomaly in the swirling white void. He blinked hard, peering through his frosted eyelashes at a large, shifting mass near the ravine entrance. He initially dismissed the movement as the restless ponies shuffling for warmth. However, the dark shape seemed to flow outward, defying the natural confinement of the draw. The soldier wiped the ice from his face with a trembling forearm, his sluggish mind struggling to process the visual information filtering through the raging blizzard. The Cheyenne riders mounted the primary equines bareback, gripping the thick manes to secure their seating. They guided the lead mares forward, initiating a slow, deliberate exodus from the crowded basin. The rest of the vast collection followed instinctively, a colossal, silent wave of muscle, and bone trailing their recognized leaders. Hundreds of hooves stepped softly through the deep powder, the powdery surface dampening the percussive impact of their footfalls. The warriors maintained a tight grip on the reins, keeping the pace steady and controlled to avoid triggering a premature panic. The observant sentry finally registered the presence of human figures seated upon the departing animals. A surge of adrenaline pierced through his hypothermic stupor, jump-starting his frozen heart. He fumbled frantically with his heavy Springfield rifle, his stiff, uncooperative fingers slipping off the metal trigger guard. The soldier opened his mouth to shout a warning, but his dry, cracked throat produced only a hoarse, weak croak that was instantly swallowed by the shrieking wind. Desperate, he managed to cock the hammer and fire a single blind shot upward into the black sky. The sharp detonation of the cartridge shattered the precarious silence of the extraction. The sudden, explosive sound, cutting through the monotonous roar of the gale, acted as a catalyst for utter chaos. The native riders, realizing their stealth cover was blown, abandoned all caution. They kicked their moccasined heels viciously into the flanks of their mounts, letting out piercing war cries that echoed fiercely across the frozen landscape. The controlled withdrawal rapidly morphed into a frantic, high-speed stampede. The entire pony drove surged forward with immense kinetic energy. 800 wild equines transitioned from a slow walk to a full, terrified gallop in a fraction of a second. The staggering physical force of the charging beasts churned the ground into a chaotic slurry of flying mud, pulverized ice, and shattered tree branches. The thunderous drumming of thousands of hooves overtook the sound of the storm, vibrating through the bedrock and shaking the very foundations of the nearby military bivouac. Men scrambled blindly through the darkness, tripping over each other in a desperate bid to locate their stacked weapons. The meager sagebrush fires were trampled out by the fleeing animals, plunging the camp into pitch-black confusion. The cavalrymen shouted frantic questions, their voices overlapping in a dissonant chorus of panic as they tried to comprehend the source of the overwhelming commotion tearing past their perimeter. Colonel Reynolds burst from his makeshift shelter, his sidearm drawn and ready. He surveyed the chaotic scene, his eyes straining to pierce the blinding flurries. He witnessed the dark, sprawling shape of the herd flowing out of the ravine and disappearing into the northern expanse. The commander bellowed orders demanding his troops mount their tethered cavalry horses and pursue the fleeing prize. The officers echoed the command, sprinting among the confused enlisted ranks, physically shoving men toward the picket lines where the military steeds stood tied. The order to pursue proved logistically impossible to execute. The domesticated chargers, starved and frozen stiff, refused to cooperate. When the frantic troopers attempted to force the bits into the animals' mouths, the beasts reared and lashed out with their iron-shod hooves. The stiffened leather saddles covered in solid sheets of ice defied all attempts at tightening the girths. The men fought a losing battle against their own mounts, wrestling with rigid straps and unyielding buckles while precious seconds ticked away, widening the gap between the army and the escaping equines. Even the few soldiers who managed to secure their saddles found their pursuit tragically flawed. The exhausted military steeds could barely muster a slow, staggering trot through the deep drifts. Their energy reserves were entirely bankrupt, their muscles seizing in the sub-zero temperatures. In stark contrast, the hardy plains ponies, adapted to the brutal environment and driven by the skilled warriors on their backs, moved with blistering speed across the treacherous terrain. The distance between the pursuers and the pursued expanded exponentially with every passing moment. A handful of frustrated troopers dismounted and waded to the edge of the camp, raising their rifles toward the retreating shadows. They fired volley after volley into the storm, the muzzle flashes illuminating the falling flakes with brief stuttering bursts of harsh light. The heavy projectiles vanished into the whiteout, finding no targets in the vast emptiness. The act of firing served merely as a futile expression of rage and impotence, a waste of vital ammunition against an enemy that had already slipped completely out of their grasp. The deafening rumble of the stampede gradually faded, swallowed by the relentless howling of the blizzard. The Cheyenne and Oglala fighters successfully drove their reclaimed wealth back toward the northern strongholds, leaving the crippled detachment stranded in the dust of their departure. The Braves executed a flawless tactical retrieval, utilizing the hostile environment, the Army's physical exhaustion, and their own superior horsemanship to reverse the sole strategic victory the cavalry had achieved during the costly morning assault. The realization of the catastrophic loss settled heavily over the commanding officers. Colonel Reynolds holstered his weapon, his posture sagging as he stared into the swirling snow. The primary objective of the entire punishing winter campaign had been the permanent confiscation of the tribal mounts to neutralize their mobility. With the drove gone, the staggering expenditure of resources, the extreme physical suffering of the men, and the blood spilled in the Powder River Valley amounted to absolutely nothing. The expedition had been completely outmaneuvered. The psychological devastation rippled through the enlisted ranks. The soldiers ceased their frantic efforts to saddle their dying horses. They dropped their stiff hands to their sides, staring blankly into the freezing tempest. They had endured frostbite, starvation, and a harrowing retreat under sniper fire, buoyed solely by the knowledge that they had dealt a crippling logistical blow to the hostile bands. That singular comfort was now violently snatched away. The men realized they had suffered the tortures of the damned for zero strategic gain. The harsh environment offered no reprieve for the demoralized troops. The temperature plunged toward 40 degrees below zero, punishing the men standing idle in the slush. The lieutenants, recognizing the danger of the sudden collective despair, ordered the soldiers to resume pacing and to attempt rebuilding the small fires. The men complied with robotic obedience, their spirits utterly broken. The camp fell into a grim, hollow silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional groan of a wounded private suffering near the weak flames. The hours crawling toward dawn proved excruciating. The cavalrymen huddled together, sharing their meager body heat, their minds replaying the humiliating theft. The tribal warriors had invaded their perimeter, stolen back 800 horses, and vanished without suffering a single casualty. The sheer audacity and flawless execution of the raid highlighted the vast disparity in environmental mastery between the frontier army and the native plains inhabitants. The soldiers felt like clumsy trespassers brutally punished by the true lords of the territory. Morning broke on March 18th with a pale, diluted illumination filtering through the thinning cloud cover. The fierce blizzard finally subsided, leaving behind a completely altered landscape buried under fresh, smooth mounds of white powder. The surviving troops stood shivering in the weak light, their faces haggard, their uniforms covered in soot and dried blood. They looked toward the narrow draw that had served as the temporary corral, confronting the physical evidence of their monumental failure. The ravine lay empty, entirely devoid of the massive equine collection. Only the churned, muddy ground and the severed hemp ropes indicated the animals had ever been there. A small detail of men trudged into the draw to assess the final count. They discovered barely 50 horses remaining scattered among the sparse timber. These beasts were the oldest, sickest, and most lame individuals of the group, animals entirely incapable of keeping pace with the frantic stampede. The tribal fighters had left the useless culls behind, taking only the strong, vital mounts required for their continued resistance. The grim tally finalized the absolute defeat of the military detachment. The commanding officers gathered near the frozen creek bank, their faces grim and drawn. They possessed a force of depleted, freezing, starving men, dozens of critically wounded casualties and dying cavalry mounts. They lacked food, shelter, and reinforcements. The tactical advantage had swung entirely back to the indigenous bands who were now remounted, enraged, and regrouping in the impassable northern mountains, ready to continue their defiant defense of their ancestral hunting grounds. The overwhelming gravity of the situation dictated the next miserable steps. The expedition required a grueling, desperate march back to Fort Fetterman, a journey of hundreds of miles through the lethal winter wasteland, carrying their crippled comrades and leading their starving beasts. The mission intended to subjugate the roaming factions had ended in a disastrous, humiliating rout. The army had struck a harsh blow by burning the village, but the tribes had countered with a masterful theft, ensuring the escalating Plains War would stretch long into the coming summer. The men formed up in ragged, disorganized columns, turning their backs on the empty draw. They began the arduous trudge southward, leaving the Powder River country behind them. The loss of the drove represented far more than just a stolen asset. It symbolized the Army's fundamental inability to control the fierce, resilient people who called this brutal landscape home. The soldiers marched in defeated silence, carrying the heavy burden of their failure, while the biting northern wind erased their tracks, swallowing the tragic remnants of their disastrous incursion into the hostile white expanse. March 26, 1876. The battered expedition stumbled through the heavy wooden gates of Fort Fetterman. Sentries standing watch atop the palisade walls stared in stunned silence at the approaching column. The pristine, highly disciplined strike force that had departed weeks earlier now resembled a hollow shell of its former glory. Returning cavalrymen rode with slumped shoulders, their empty eyes staring blankly at the packed earth of the parade ground. The stark visual contrast between their proud departure and their current ruined state shocked the garrison personnel assigned to welcome the weary travelers back into the fortified perimeter. The physical toll inflicted upon the returning troops proved staggering. Haggard faces bore the unmistakable dark, necrotic stains of severe frostbite. Their woolen uniforms hung in dirty tatters, stained with dried blood, animal grease, and the omnipresent black soot from the burned village. The stench of unwashed bodies, mingled with the foul odor of infected wounds and rotting flesh, creating a noxious cloud that hung thickly around the dismounting soldiers. These exhausted survivors possessed no remaining energy to celebrate their return to relative safety, merely collapsing beside their weary steeds the moment they cleared the main entrance. Medical response commenced without delay. Hospital stewards rushed from the infirmary carrying canvas stretchers and sturdy wooden splints. They assisted the crippled privates down from their saddles, listening to the agonizing groans of men whose fractured bones ground together with every forced movement. Caretakers worked frantically to prioritize the casualties, separating those requiring urgent surgical intervention from those merely suffering from deep caloric depletion and Arctic exposure. The courtyard transformed into a chaotic triage center, filled with the desperate sounds of human suffering as the true scale of the medical emergency became apparent. Inside the cramped infirmary, the atmosphere grew incredibly oppressive. The crude wooden structure quickly filled with the vocalizations of the injured. Thawing frozen limbs inflicted unimaginable torment upon the victims, as the warmth of the cast-iron stoves penetrated their damaged extremities. The restricted blood vessels expanded rapidly, sending waves of pure, blinding pain through the reviving nerve endings. The pervasive scent of gangrene forced the attending medical staff to tie kerchiefs tightly over their noses while navigating the crowded, bloody aisles to reach the men most in need of amputations. Frontier surgeons prepared their bone saws and sharp scalpels. The isolated outpost lacked adequate supplies of ether or chloroform, forcing the doctors to operate without modern anesthetics. 4 sturdy orderlies held each writhing patient down upon the blood-stained operating tables. Physicians worked with ruthless efficiency, severing blackened dead toes and removing useless fingers to halt the spread of the lethal infection. The harsh scraping of metal teeth against bone echoed continuously through the drafty ward, creating a horrifying symphony of frontier medicine. General George Crook observed the chaotic triage from the doorway. His legendary stoicism fractured into visible, seething anger. He evaluated the total operational failure of the Powder River foray with a cold, calculating eye. The objective had been to cripple the hostile bands and force their capitulation. Instead, the cavalry had merely managed to enrage the native population while sacrificing its own men and vital resources in a poorly executed, disorganized scramble. The overarching strategy lay in complete ruins, leaving the department commander to grapple with the disastrous ramifications of the botched winter offensive. Crook retreated to his headquarters to review the official reports submitted by his subordinate officers. Written accounts contain numerous discrepancies, highlighting the deep breakdown of communication during the panicked withdrawal. Battalion commanders engaged in blatant blame shifting, each attempting to shield their specific units from the looming consequences of the disastrous expedition. The general read through the stained, hastily scribbled pages, his fury mounting with every documented tactical error and blatant breach of protocol recorded in the dispatches. The paper trail confirmed a systematic collapse of leadership during the most critical phases. Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds faced his superior inside the dimly lit office. The tense confrontation lacked any customary military pleasantries. Crook demanded answers for the specific catastrophic failures that occurred under Reynolds' direct command. The colonel stood rigidly at attention, attempting to justify the fragmented retreat and the loss of the captured assets. But his explanations rang hollow against the undeniable evidence of the ruined men recovering in the adjacent hospital. The seasoned leader's excuses withered under the commanding general's intense scrutiny, exposing the fatal flaws in his decision-making process under pressure. The first major accusation leveled against the veteran cavalry officer concerned the unforgivable abandonment of Private Lorenzo Ayres and the men left on the field. Leaving living soldiers behind in hostile territory constituted the ultimate breach of the military brotherhood. Crook viewed this failure not merely as a tactical mistake, but as a deep moral cowardice that severely damaged the fundamental trust between the enlisted ranks and their appointed leaders. The basic foundational pact of the armed forces had been entirely compromised, creating a dangerous rift in morale that threatened the stability of the entire frontier regiment. The second primary charge focused on the loss of the confiscated pony drove. Securing those animals had been the entire strategic purpose of the costly morning assault. By failing to post adequate guards and allowing the native fighters to reclaim their vital transportation, Reynolds had completely negated the entire operation. The staggering expenditure of government funds and human life had yielded absolutely zero tangible results for the War Department. The tribes retained their wealth and their unmatched mobility on the plains, rendering the entire punishing winter trek completely meaningless. Crook drafted formal complaints on his oak desk. He utilized his steel pen to outline the specific failures of the expedition for higher review. The matter would eventually culminate in Reynolds's court-martial the following winter, publicly staining the seasoned officer's record. Even before that later trial, the harsh reckoning served as a stark warning to the remaining officers stationed at the Wyoming outpost, establishing a rigid standard of accountability for the brutal summer campaign looming on the horizon. Captain Henry Noyes also faced formal censure for his conduct during the confused withdrawal and the loss of the captured herd. The systemic breakdown of leadership extended deep into the officer corps. Later proceedings found fault with his actions and he was formally reprimanded. The public scrutiny surrounding the expedition exposed the embarrassing internal flaws of the frontier army, inviting intense civilian attention to the military's handling of the Native American crisis. Enlisted ranks reacted to the impending disciplinary actions with a complex mixture of vindication and deep-seated bitterness. They felt a dark satisfaction seeing the responsible commanders held accountable for the disaster. However, the pending legal proceedings offered no real comfort for the permanent mutilations they had endured. Nor could the tribunals resurrect the comrades left to die alone in the frozen canyon. A cynical mood settled permanently over the wooden barracks, extinguishing any lingering romantic notions of frontier glory and replacing them with a hardened survivalist mentality among the combat veterans. The Quartermaster Corps took a depressing inventory of the surviving mounts. Devastating loss of specialized cavalry beasts crippled the regiment's operational readiness. Hundreds of imported grain-fed horses had perished on the treacherous trail. Surviving animals were emaciated, their hooves cracked and their lungs permanently damaged by the high altitude and freezing temperatures. Veterinarians condemned dozens of the remaining steeds, ordering them to be shot due to incurable lameness and irreparable physical ruin. The sharp cracks of the executioner's pistol echoed across the parade ground, further depleting the equestrian resources. The telegraph operator at the fort tapped out the dismal dispatch to Chicago. Electrical signals traveled across the vast empty plains carrying the news of the failed winter strike to Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan. The message detailed the heavy casualties, the loss of the indigenous herd, and the complete failure to compel the roaming bands onto the designated reservations. Bureaucratic planners realized their aggressive timeline had broken against the harsh realities of the untamed wilderness and the unyielding indigenous resistance. Sheridan paced his comfortable headquarters upon receiving the frustrating report. The realization set in that the hostile factions would not capitulate through a single, isolated winter strike. The Cheyenne and Oglala had proven their absolute resilience and their lethal capability. The commander understood that subduing the high plains required a colossal, unprecedented summer mobilization. He began drafting new orders, preparing to flood the territory with thousands of fresh troops once the snow finally melted and the travel routes became passable, escalating the regional skirmishes into a full-scale theater of war. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, displaced native survivors traversed the frozen Badlands. Their grueling trek towards safety tested the absolute limits of their physical endurance. Stripped of their warm lodges and calorie-dense food stores, the refugees relied entirely on their deep knowledge of the land to survive. They sought out natural caves and deep ravines, huddling together to share vital body heat during the punishing subzero nights. The harsh landscape demanded everything they had left to offer, transforming their journey into an agonizing test of willpower. Indigenous families carried the few meager possessions they had managed to salvage from the flames. Extreme suffering fell heaviest upon the young and the elderly, who lacked the robust physical strength to fight off the relentless chill. Mothers wrapped their infants in salvaged scraps of charred buffalo hide, pressing the small bodies against their own skin to stave off hypothermia. Warriors hunted constantly, bringing down sparse game to provide the essential protein necessary to keep their people moving forward toward salvation, often going without sustenance themselves to feed the most vulnerable. Chief Two Moons guided his Cheyenne followers steadily northward, navigating toward the established encampments of the Hunkpapa Lakota. Unprovoked military aggression triggered a colossal strategic shift among the disparate factions. Tribes realized that remaining isolated in small, vulnerable winter camps invited systematic annihilation. Survival now demanded complete unification. Fragmented bands began converging on the Yellowstone drainage, pooling their remaining resources and consolidating their fighting strength to counter the existential threat posed by the encroaching American forces. The shared enemy erased old rivalries, fostering a new era of unprecedented intertribal cooperation. Sitting Bull welcomed the destitute refugees into his sprawling village. The Hunkpapa leader offered sanctuary, sharing his people's abundant food stores and providing materials to construct new shelters. The influx of the battered Oglala and Cheyenne swelled the size of the combined camp. Shared trauma forged an unbreakable bond between the various groups, solidifying a powerful alliance that the United States government had never anticipated. The vast settlement transformed into a bustling hub of indigenous unity and shared purpose, teeming with thousands of individuals dedicated to a singular cause of mutual defense. Council fires burned late into the night. Survivors stood before the gathered chiefs recounting the devastating assault on the Powder River. They described the soldiers trampling their homes, incinerating their winter robes, and destroying their vital meat supplies. Elders listened intently to the harrowing tales, their weathered faces reflecting a collective grief for the tremendous hardships inflicted upon their kin. Spoken words painted a vivid picture of absolute cruelty and relentless military aggression, cementing the Army's reputation as a merciless, invading force bent on total cultural eradication. Tales of the Army's ruthless tactics ignited a fierce, unyielding fury among the allied tribes. Initial shock of the attack rapidly crystallized into a hardened desire for righteous vengeance. Warriors painted their faces and performed ancient ceremonies, dedicating themselves to the impending conflict. The cavalry had intended to break their spirit, but the burning of the village had instead forged a unified, highly motivated native army determined to defend their traditional way of life to the bitter end. The warriors sharpened their blades and checked their firearms, eager for the chance to retaliate. Messengers rode out from the massive camp carrying the call to arms across the Dakota and Wyoming territories. These runners visited the established reservation agencies, spreading the news of the military's unprovoked aggression. Accounts of the slaughter radicalized the young men living under strict government control. Frustrated by broken treaties and meager rations, hundreds of restless braves decided to abandon the restrictive agencies and join the growing resistance movement gathering on the untamed northern plains, leaving the safety of the reservations to embrace the dangerous free life of the roaming factions. The long, brutal winter finally began to yield to the spring thaw. Thick snowpack melted into rushing streams and vibrant prairie grass returned to the plains. This environmental shift provided abundant, natural forage for the growing native horse herds. Recovering animals regained their vital strength and stamina, ensuring the warriors would possess the vast mobility required to combat the heavy military columns preparing to march against them in the coming warmer months. The changing seasons signaled a close to the period of vulnerability, ushering in the optimal conditions for widespread plains warfare. A steady stream of willing recruits flowed into Sitting Bull's swelling coalition. The influx of fresh fighters brought smuggled firearms and vital ammunition purchased illicitly from unscrupulous traders. The sheer magnitude of the gathering force surpassed any previous alliance in the region's history. Distinct bands organized themselves into a cohesive, highly functional society, capable of sustaining thousands of people while aggressively preparing for the inevitable, widespread summer war looming on the horizon. The once scattered encampments had evolved into a centralized, militarized nation ready to assert sovereignty over their ancestral domain. The military's intended preemptive strike had ironically created the precise scenario they had desperately hoped to prevent. By forcing the displaced Cheyenne into the welcoming arms of the militant Lakota, the failed expedition forged the largest indigenous fighting force ever assembled on the continent. Isolated bands were now a singular, formidable superpower, positioned perfectly to challenge the encroaching American. Expansion and defend their sacred hunting grounds with unmatched ferocity and overwhelming numerical superiority. The tactical blunder in the snowy canyon had essentially guaranteed a massive, bloody reckoning for the United States Army. Back at Fort Fetterman, surviving cavalrymen recovered slowly. Permanent physical scars served as constant reminders of the icy canyon, but internal psychological wounds ran much deeper. Veterans carried the heavy burden of their defeat and the haunting memories of the comrades they had abandoned to the enemy. Arrogant assumptions of effortless victory had been thoroughly discarded, replaced by a dark respect for the lethal capabilities of the resilient plains warriors. The soldiers cleaned their weapons and drilled on the parade ground, knowing their next deployment would lead them back into the heart of the resistance. The isolated garrison spent the warming months preparing for the upcoming summer campaign. Fresh infantry regiments arrived via the railhead, swelling the fort's overall population. Colossal supply trains hauled tons of provisions, heavy artillery pieces, and vast quantities of ammunition into the bustling staging area. The army meticulously rebuilt its shattered logistical apparatus, determined to crush the native resistance through sheer, overwhelming numbers and relentless coordinated pressure across the entire territory. The vast industrial might of the federal government focused its complete attention on the subjugation of the defiant northern tribes. The stark contrast between the bureaucratic planning in distant Washington and the bleak reality of the frontier conflict became entirely apparent. Politicians envisioned a swift, clean subjugation of the roaming factions, ignoring the vast, unforgiving terrain and the unyielding resolve of the indigenous people. Men stationed on the absolute edge of the wilderness understood the true cost of this imperial ambition, knowing the upcoming battles would demand an incredibly high toll in human blood and untold suffering. The frontier soldiers prepared to execute policies drafted by men who had never felt the bite of a prairie blizzard. The stage was irreversibly set for the monumental clashes of the coming months. The disastrous failure of the Powder River foray guaranteed a long, grueling conflict. Opposing forces gathered their respective strength, destined to collide fiercely at the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn. The botched winter strike had ignited a colossal, uncontrollable inferno, ensuring the Great Sioux War would consume the high plains in a violent, tragic struggle for ultimate control of the sprawling American West. The blood spilled in the frozen slush of the destroyed village merely served as a grim prelude to the historic slaughter awaiting both nations.